A supply wagon pulled away from the boardwalk. Then the sound rose behind it, hoofbeats steady, unhurried, the measured rhythm of men checking every wagon one by one. In the back, between flour sacks and winter blankets, a young woman lay flat, knees drawn tight to her chest, a small cloth bag clenched in both hands, her pink dress still damp with mud at the hem. She did not breathe deep. The man on the box seat stopped, climbed down, walked to the rear as if only tightening a strap, lifted the canvas. 3 riders emerged through the dust at the north end of the street. Not fast, not loud. Simply thorough. Her shoes were cream-colored, small buttons up the side. The kind a woman wore to stand before a preacher. Not the kind she wore jolting through the back of a stranger's wagon on a road no one used in October. The canvas had not yet fallen shut. Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory. October 1887. Silas Rourke had been in town 3 hours. Felt like 10. That was the thing about towns. They didn't move at the pace of work. They moved at the pace of talk. And talk had never been his language. Not since Micah. 4 years now. 4 years since his brother's name stopped being something people said to his face and started being something they said behind his back, careful. Like it might still be sharp enough to cut somebody if they weren't careful how they handled it. Silas didn't blame them for that. He'd have lowered his voice, too. He'd grown up in towns like this one, actually. Small ones. Tight ones. Places where everybody knew whose credit was good and whose name opened doors and whose didn't, and a boy learned that machinery early, or he learned it the hard way, in the schoolyard, with his knuckles. Silas had learned it early, had been good at it, once. Knew how to nod at the right moment and ask after somebody's mother and laugh at a joke a half-second before the punchline landed, the way you were supposed to. That had been before the ranch, before Micah. 4 years of cattle and fence line and his own silence had worn all of that off him, like water off a rock. Worn it off slow enough that he hadn't noticed until it was gone. He remembered the day it started going. Remembered it clear, the way a man remembers the exact moment a fence line finally gives, way after months of quiet rot nobody bothered fixing. A rider from the county seat, hat in his hands, standing in the yard with the particular careful posture of a man about to say something he'd rather not be the one saying. Your brother's horse came back without him. 6 words. That was all it had taken. 6 words, and the whole shape of Silas Rourke's life had folded up small and put itself away, someplace he had managed to find again since. Micah had been the one with the plans, the talker, the one who could walk into a bank in Cheyenne and walk out with better terms than he'd walked in, expecting, just from the sheer, easy confidence of a man who believed the world generally worked out, if you were patient and clever about it. Silas had believed that, too, once. Secondhand, borrowed off his brother's certainty, the way a younger man borrows most of his convictions before he's earned any of his own. He didn't believe it anymore. Hadn't, not really. Since the morning that rider stood in his yard with his hat in his hands. He stopped at the mercantile first. Old man Kettering behind the counter, same as always, weighing out flour with the theatrical precision of a man who suspected everybody of trying to cheat him and had never once been proven wrong, not that he'd admit. Rourke. Kettering didn't look up from the scale. Didn't expect you before the passes closed. Needed supplies. Everybody needs supplies. Don't see everybody in here. Kettering finally looked up, squinted. You look thin. I look like I always look. You look thin. Kettering said again, like repetition made it truer, and went back to his flour. Silas let that sit. Didn't argue. Arguing with Kettering was like arguing with weather technically possible, entirely pointless. Outside, through the front window, he could see the street doing something he didn't like the shape of. People moving too fast, or too slow, or not moving at all, standing in doorways with their arms crossed, the specific posture of folks who know something's happening and have decided, deliberately, not to be part of finding out what. Something going on today? Silas asked. Kettering's hands paused over the scale. Just barely. A man who noticed things for a living. Noticing something he didn't especially want to notice out loud. Wedding, Kettering said. Up at the Vale place. Didn't know Vale had children old enough to marry. He doesn't. Kettering tied off the flour sack. Quick final. Like he was tying off the conversation along with it. That'll be $4 even, Silas paid. Didn't ask the follow-up question, sitting right there in his mouth, because something in the set of Kettering's shoulders told him the answer wasn't going to be the kind of thing a man wanted to carry around with him for the rest of the day. He should have asked anyway. He'd think that later, plenty of times, lying awake running the day back through his hands like a rope he was checking for frayed spots. He should have asked. He didn't. Outside, he ran into Widow Halloran, coming out of the dressmaker's with a parcel under one arm and opinions enough for 3 women. She'd known his mother back before his mother passed, and she'd taken it upon herself, in the years since, to keep some kind of watch over the surviving Rourke boy, whether he wanted watching or not. Silas Rourke. She said his full name like it was an accusation. You're thin, so I've heard. Well, you are. A man living alone eats like a man living alone, which is to say poorly. She adjusted her parcel. You hear about the wedding? Heard there was one. That poor Marsh girl. Widow Halloran lowered her voice, though there was nobody close enough to overhear, and she knew it, the lowering being more theater than necessity. Her mother not 6 months in the ground, and already married off to settle a debt. Constance would be spinning in her grave, God rest her, spinning like a top. Didn't know the particulars, Silas said, which was true, and which he was already beginning to regret. Well, you wouldn't, would you? Out at that ranch of yours, seeing nobody but cattle. She said it without unkindness, mostly though it landed with a small sting anyway. Cormac Vale held the notes, called them due the day after the girl's mother was buried, if you can credit that kind of timing. Man's got no more Christian feeling than a fence post. Nobody stopped it? Stopped it how? Widow Halloran's eyebrows went up. Man's got half the county in his pocket, and the other half too frightened to say otherwise out loud. Reverend Hale tried talking sense into the girl's situation, for all the good it did. Vale's got lawyers of his own, and money enough to make any objection look like foolishness by the time it's finished. Silas felt something tighten low in his gut, an old familiar tightening, the kind he associated without wanting to, with a certain kind of injustice that dressed itself up in paperwork and called itself business. Anyhow, Widow Halloran patted his arm, brisk, done with the subject as quickly as she'd opened it. You eat something today. Promise me. I'll see to it. She bustled off, parcel and opinions and all, and Silas stood a moment on the boardwalk, turning her words over, not yet knowing how soon he'd be turning over considerably more than words on the very same subject. He loaded the wagon instead, flour, salt pork, 2 boxes of shells, a new axe handle, because the old one had split clean through in September, and he still didn't fully trust the crack he'd tried to glue. 4 blankets rated for a hard winter, a sack of coffee that would last him to March if he rationed it, which he would, because rationing was a thing he'd gotten good at over 4 years. Rationing coffee. Rationing conversation, rationing hope on the days that called for it, though he'd never once said that particular word out loud to another living person. Larkspur Hollow had what he needed, nothing he wanted. He checked the harness, tightened a buckle that didn't need tightening, stalling, and he knew it, and let himself do it anyway, because something about the street still felt wrong, and not being able to name a wrongness was its own particular itch, the kind that sat under the skin and refused to be scratched properly. He climbed onto the box, picked up the reins, and that was when he heard it, a sound from the back of the wagon, fabric shifting. A boot heel finding new purchase against the wood, careful trying and failing to be silent. Silas went still, not scared still, ranch still, the kind of stillness a man learns when there's a rattler close by, and the wrong move costs far more than the right one. He set the reins down slow, climbed off the box, like his knees ached, though they didn't, walked to the back of the wagon, like a man double-checking a strap, unhurried, ordinary, the picture of a man with nothing on his mind but rope and canvas, pulled the flap aside, and found a woman, sitting wedged between the flour sacks and the blankets, knees drawn up to her chest, a small cloth bag clutched in both hands like it was the last solid thing left in a world that had recently stopped making sense. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither one said a single word for a stretch of time that felt considerably longer than it actually was. She was young, 22 maybe, or near enough, dark hair, coming loose from its pins in a way that told him nobody, not even herself, had put it up carefully that morning. Brown eyes doing arithmetic, fast, furious. He could nearly watch the numbers move behind them, danger or door, which one is he? Her dress was pink, simple, a small stain at the hem still damp. She'd been running recently, through something wet. You planning to say something, Silas said, or should I guess? Close the flap, she whispered. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting until you close the flap. Somewhere down the street he heard it. Horses. Moving at a particular gait, not fast, not urgent, but thorough. Checking the pace of men who had all the time in the world and intended to use every last minute of it. Her eyes flicked toward the sound, snapped back to him. "Pretend I'm your wife," she said, "until we're out of town." He almost laughed. Would have on a different day, at a different woman, in a different sentence completely. That's a lot to ask of a stranger. You have a better idea? I have several. None of them involve marrying you in the next 90 seconds. I don't need a ceremony, she hissed. I need you to not hand me over. That's the whole request. Silas Rourke looked at this woman, hiding in his flour and his blankets, with horses closing in, and a bag clutched like a prayer, and absolutely nothing about her situation explained to him beyond the plain, undeniable fact that she was terrified and trying, admirably, not to show it. He didn't know her name, didn't know what she'd done, or what had been done to her, or which one of those was the truth he'd be signing his name to if he said yes. But he knew the sound of men hunting something, knew it in his bones, the specific rhythm of it, and he knew what it meant when a person hid from that sound instead of walking toward it, hands open, ready to explain themselves. Nobody hides from a fair fight. Get down, he said. Lie flat, blanket over you now. She didn't argue. Didn't ask why. Didn't ask for reassurance. Just moved quick, quiet, practiced in a way that told him this wasn't the first time in her life she'd had to disappear on short notice, like she'd been waiting her whole life for somebody to hand her an order worth following without a fight attached to it. He dropped the flap, walked back to the front, like his heart wasn't doing something unreasonable in his chest, picked up the reins. Under the blanket, Adeline lay flat against the wagon boards, breathing shallow, counting because counting was the only thing that kept the panic from climbing all the way up into her throat and staying there. 1, 2. Her mother used to say that 2 count when the fear gets ahead of you. Count until your hands remember how to be steady again. 3, 4. She could hear her own pulse louder than the wind. Could hear, or thought she could, the specific creak of the wagon shifting as this stranger, this man whose name she didn't even know yet, climbed back up onto the box like nothing at all was wrong. She had exactly one plan, and the plan had been hide and hope, which wasn't much of a plan at all. When she thought about it plainly, lying there in the dark under a wool blanket that smelled like cedar and horse and someone else's whole entire life, she'd run out of better options somewhere around dawn, when she'd realized the dress laid out for her pale and beaded and utterly wrong. For the life she actually wanted was going to be the last decision anyone let her make for herself if she didn't do something drastic in the next several hours. So she'd done something drastic, climbed into the back of the first wagon she found unattended, and prayed. And here she was now, flat on cold boards, listening to her own heartbeat, and a stranger's voice, answering questions about a wife he didn't have, and thinking, absurdly, in the middle of all of it, I don't even know if he's a kind man. I've bet everything on a stranger's face. 3 riders coming from the north end of the street. Not fast, that was the part that told him everything he needed to know. Fast meant panic, and panic burned itself out inside of a mile. This wasn't panic. This was men checking wagons one at a time because somebody had told them to, and told them in a tone that didn't leave room for half measures. Silas knew who they rode for before they were close enough to speak a word. Everybody in the county knew Cormac Vale's men, not because any one of them was remarkable, because none of them needed to be. That was the trick of it, the quiet horror of it if you thought about it too long, which Silas generally tried not to. Ordinary men, doing an ordinary job. For a man whose money turned cruelty into something that looked, from far enough away, almost like weather. Something that simply happened. Something nobody in particular had chosen to make happen. The lead rider pulled up alongside the wagon, lean, weathered around the eyes in a way that suggested he'd earned every line of it. Honestly, whatever that meant for a man in his line of work. Morning, Silas said back. Flat, even. You ride in from the East Road? South, Rourke Place, 12 miles out. Something flickered across the rider's face at the name, small fast. Gone before Silas could fully catch hold of it and turn it over to see what it was made of. Rourke, the rider repeated, like he was tasting the word, deciding whether he liked it. That's right. The rider's eyes moved over the wagon, the open front, the supplies stacked plain and visible, Nothing hidden about any single inch of it, except the one thing that mattered more than every other item combined. You see a young woman coming into town, dark hair, pink dress. Silas thought about it, had exactly half a second to think about it properly, and spend every last piece of that half second on only calculation that mattered. He didn't yet know why she was running, which meant he didn't yet know whether handing her over was the righteous thing to do or the rotten one. And until he knew the answer to that, the benefit of the doubt belonged to her, not to three men checking wagons like the whole street was theirs to search. "My wife's in the back," he said. "Not feeling well. Motion sickness." The rider looked at the wagon. Silas did not look at the canvas, kept his eyes level on the rider instead, the way a man looks at another man when he's answered a plain question honestly and is simply waiting, unbothered, for whatever came next. From behind the canvas came a small sound, a shift. Then nothing. Then the flap moved, and a woman looked out at the three riders with the composed, faintly put-upon expression of someone who is unwell and does not appreciate the audience. Her hair was looser now than it had been 30 seconds prior. Her cheeks had color that hadn't been there before, either color she'd manufactured herself. He'd learn later, with 2 fingers and a hard, practiced pinch, because she understood exactly what a sick woman was supposed to look like and had decided, on the spot, to become one convincingly. "Silas," she said. Just like that. Like she'd said it 1,000 times before breakfast, not performing familiarity. Using it, plain and worn in. The way you use a name you've said so often, it doesn't feel like a lie anymore, even when it still, technically, is one. "Are we going?" she asked, with the specific weary edge of a woman interrupted mid-suffering. "I'd rather not be sick in front of God and every rider in the county." In a moment, he said. He looked back at the lead rider. "Something else you need?" The rider looked at her, looked at him, looked back at her. Then his eyes dropped to her feet. Cream-colored shoes, small buttons up the side. The kind of shoes a woman wears to stand in front of a preacher, not the kind she wears jolting along in the back of a supply wagon. "Those are some fine shoes," the rider said, slow, for a woman who's sick to her stomach. "They were the only ones by the door," Adeline said, before Silas could open his mouth to answer for her. "I wasn't given time to be particular." "Wasn't given time by who?" "By my stomach. Crap," she said, flat, and looked at him like the question was beneath her patience. "Is there a law now about footwear in Wyoming Territory? Because if there is, I'd like it read to me slowly. I'm not at my sharpest." The rider's jaw worked once, twice. A man deciding whether he'd just been outmaneuvered by a woman who was, by every visible measure, worse off than he was. He shifted in his saddle, started to swing a leg over, like he meant to climb down and see for himself, get a closer look at the woman in the wagon and the shoes that didn't match her story. Silas's whole body went taut, quiet, ready. He didn't reach for anything. Didn't need to. Just angled himself, slightly, so that stepping down off that horse would put the rider closer to Silas than to the wagon, and let his face say the rest of it, plain and easy. "You're welcome to try. I'd think it through first." The rider settled back into his saddle instead. Some calculation of his own working itself out behind his eyes. A stranger's wagon wasn't worth a broken jaw over a hunch. Not when Vale paid the same whether the job got done clean or got done ugly. And ugly tended to draw questions a smart man learned to avoid. "You'll let us know," the rider said. Instead, "if you happen to come across her. Mr. Vale's offering a fair reward." "I'll bear it in mind," Silas said. "See that you do." Silas moved the wagon before the man finished deciding whether he believed a word of it. Not dramatic. Not fast enough to look like flight. He simply said, "Ball." She dressed before she felt it coming on, flat as a fact nobody bothers arguing with, and flicked the reins. And the horse walked forward, because horses walk forward when you tell them to. And the wagon was already in motion before the rider had settled on what to do about an answer he didn't fully believe and couldn't quite disprove either. They let him go 30 seconds. Maybe less. Then he heard them behind him. Not chasing, following, which was worse. Chasing had urgency in it, and urgency burns itself out fast a mile, maybe 2. Following had patience, and patience, Silas knew from long and unpleasant experience, could ride a man a great deal farther than urgency ever managed to. He turned the wagon hard at the feed store corner. No signal, no warning. Took the alley behind the mercantile, narrow enough that one wheel scraped a barrel some fool had left too close to the wall, and came out on the old mill road, that ran parallel to the main street, a road nobody used in October because the ruts were deep enough to swallow a wheel whole, and the footing was at best a rumor. The wagon held. He hadn't known if it would. Found out that it would. Filed the information away the way he esteemed most things, quiet, unspoken, ready for whenever it might matter again. "You could have warned me," Adeline said from somewhere behind him, gripping the side rail with both hands as the wagon lurched through a rut deep enough to rattle her teeth. "You could have picked better shoes." "I wasn't given time to be particular," she said again, through her teeth this time. "I believe we covered that." "We did. Is there a smoother road anywhere in this county?" "There's the main road. It's got riders on it." Point taken. 20 minutes of rough ground and rougher breathing later, he came out on the east fork of the mountain road and pushed the horse to a pace that wasn't comfortable but was sustainable. And somewhere in those 20 minutes, the sound behind him thinned, then vanished. He didn't stop. Not for another mile. Not until his own breathing had evened out and his hands had loosened on the reins and he could actually hear, wind moving through the aspens instead of just the blood pounding in his own ears. That was when she came forward. Climbed out from under the blanket, up onto the seat beside him, without asking, yes, without a word, like she'd already decided the front of a wagon, and the back of one belonged to the same country now, and she held citizenship in both. Her cream shoes were ruined, soaked through, mud to the head. Not at him.
"They'll take the main road,"
she said. "I know," he said. "That's why we're not on it. Where does this one go?" "Eventually. My ranch, long way round through the North Valley." She went quiet. The Wyoming October held on hard around them. Gold aspens, everywhere he looked. Sky that particular thin, sharp blue that tells you, without a single word spoken, that winter is finished, waiting politely for an invitation. "I should explain," she said, after a while. "You should." She looked down at her hands, like the explanation might be written there if she looked hard enough. "My name is Adeline Marsh. My mother was a seamstress, here in Larkspur Hollow. She passed in March." A pause. "She left debts, more than I ever knew about. The man those riders work for, Cormac Vale, he held the notes on most of them." "I know who Vale is," Silas said. "Then you already know what he wanted in exchange." He looked at the road. "The wedding was today," she said. "This afternoon. At the Vale place." He said nothing, for a stretch of road that felt a good deal longer than it was. "How long were you planning to sit in the back of my wagon?" "Until Larkspur Hollow was well behind us." "And after that?" She looked toward the mountains. Didn't answer right away. "I didn't have an after that," she said finally. "Not yet. Not much of a plan," she said, "right up until the part where I'd have needed one." He almost smiled at that. Almost caught it before it finished arriving and put it away someplace private. They rode. She sat. The Wyoming afternoon moved past them, and neither one filled the silence with anything at all. And that surprised them both, though neither said so out loud. She told him the rest over the following hour, in pieces, the way things come out of a person when the landscape has no ears and the man beside her isn't rushing her toward the end of the sentence. Cormac Vale had been in her mother's life before her mother died. He'd offered credit during a slow winter when the seamstress work had thinned and the cold had gone on longer than any savings could stretch to cover. The rates he'd quoted, the rates her mother had believed and repeated to Adeline like scripture, were the rates of a man doing a kindness. They were not the rates written on the actual paper. Adeline had found that out 2 weeks prior. Going through her mother's things, finding the real notes tucked behind a false bottom in a sewing box, and understanding cold all the way through, that everything she'd been told her entire life about that arrangement had been a story built for her, on purpose, by somebody with a very specific ending already in mind. Vale hadn't lent her mother money. He'd wound a rope around her mother's neck, one slow twist of interest at a time, until a debt that should have been survivable had become a mountain no seamstress alive could ever climb, and he'd built it that way on purpose, so there'd only ever be one door left standing at the end of it, the one he wanted her walking through. "He built it?" she said. "Yes," Silas said. "You're not surprised. Men like Vale don't end up holding somebody's debt by accident," Silas said. "A man that patient's usually the one who wrote the trap in the first place." What was he really after? She was quiet a second before she answered her own question. "My mother's property. South edge of town. My grandfather left it to her. There's a creek running clean through the middle of it." She looked toward the mountains again, like the land itself might stand as her witness. Vale owns everything on both sides of that creek, except for that one piece. Without it, he can't get water rights to whatever it is he's building out there. Silas thought about water, about land, about the particular, unhurried patience of a man who planned in years, not months, and never once looked, from the outside, menaced like he was planning anything at all. He thought about a seamstress, offered kindness at a fair rate by the richest man in the county, who hadn't understood, until it was far too late to matter, exactly what that kindness had been built for. He thought about a young woman in a ruined pink dress, sitting on the seat of a stranger's wagon, because the wedding meant to save her had been engineered by the very same hands that were supposedly saving her from ruin. "The property," he said, "is it yours now?" "It should be. My mother's will leaves it to me." She hesitated. "Vale says the debt transfers with the estate. Says the land's the only asset worth enough to cover it." "That's not entirely true," Silas said. She looked at him, sharp, like the sentence carried more weight than she'd been braced for. "How would you know that?" Something moved behind his eyes. Small, fast. Gone before she could catch hold of it and name it. "My brother," he said, "before he came out here, practiced law." The word sat between them for a second. "He used to talk about debt transfer. Said the notes have to specifically name the property as collateral at the time they're written. If they don't, I don't have the notes," she said. "I saw them. Didn't take them. Didn't know I'd need to." He nodded. "Says slow. Out here," he said, "the law's mostly whatever the man with the most money says it is. That's how Vale's built his whole life on it, brick by brick, and nobody's ever once made him answer for it. But my brother," he stopped, started again, careful, like the sentence had a rotted board hidden somewhere inside it he didn't want to put his weight on. "He used to say if you can get things in front of a federal marshal, Washington's paper still carries weight, even against a man like Vale." She looked at him like that mattered a great deal more than he understood. He kept his eyes on the road, because looking back at her felt like standing too close to a fire he hadn't yet decided whether he wanted to be warmed by. He was thinking, without meaning to, about the last real conversation he'd had with Micah, 2 nights before the accident. His brother sitting at the kitchen table, later than usual, papers spread out in front of him, that particular furrow between his eyebrows he only got when a thing wasn't adding up the way it ought to. "Something wrong with the Hendricks lease?" Silas had asked him. "Nothing to do with the Hendricks lease," Micah had said, not looking up. Then after a while, quieter, "You ever notice how the folks who need help most are usually the ones who get offered the worst kind of it, dressed up to look like the best?" Silas hadn't thought much of it at the time. "Filed away the way he filed most things," Micah said, half listened, assuming there'd be time later to ask what he'd meant by it properly. There hadn't been time later. That was the thing nobody warned you about grief, how many conversations got left half-finished, filed away for a later that quietly stopped existing. "You keep saying used to," Adeline said quietly. He didn't answer that one. "Not right away." "He's not out here with you," she said. "Not quite a question." "No, I'm sorry. You didn't do anything." "I know," she said. "I'm still sorry." He looked at her, briefly, and something in his chest did something it hadn't done in 4 years. Something he didn't have a ready name for, and he looked back at the road before it could finish happening. They rode. The afternoon cooled around them. The road began to climb, and somewhere behind them, on the road they weren't taking, Vale's men were doing their own quiet arithmetic, and Silas Rourke didn't know yet that the men behind him weren't going to turn out to be the worst thing that found them that night. Something a great deal less patient than Cormac Vale was already coming down out of the mountains to meet them. At the Vale estate, 6 miles east of Larkspur Hollow, the wedding that hadn't happened had left behind it a parlor full of untouched cake and a great many guests who had learned, over the course of an increasingly uncomfortable afternoon, exactly how a powerful man behaves when the world declines to cooperate with his plans. Cormac Vale stood at the window of his study, watching the first snow of the season begin to dust the yard below, and did not look like a man in the grip of any particular emotion at all. That was, in its way, the most alarming thing about him. He had built his entire life on the principle that visible anger was a luxury poor men indulged in and rich men could not afford, because visible anger told the world exactly where a man's leverage ran out. Cormac Vale's leverage, as a rule, did not run out. Behind him, a young clerk named Corbett stood near the door, wishing with his whole soul that he had found some excuse to be anywhere else in the county that particular hour. "She's not been found," Vale said. "Not a question." "No, sir. Cobb and 2 others rode out after her, followed a wagon south, then lost the trail near the mill road, whose wagon belonged to a rancher. Rourke, sir. Silas Rourke. Something in Vale's shoulders went very slightly still, the way a man goes still when a name lands somewhere he didn't expect it to land. Rourke, he repeated, turned from the window at last. That name is familiar to me. His brother was a lawyer, sir, some years back. Micah Rourke. Died in an accident, if I recall, a fall out on the North Trail. Vale said nothing for a long moment. His face gave away exactly as much as he intended it to, which was to say nothing whatsoever. I recall the name, he said finally, mild as milk, and Corbett, who had worked for Cormac Vale 3 years and had learned to read a certain quality of his employer's mildness the way a sailor learns to read weather, felt a small cold drop settle somewhere behind his sternum. Shall I send more riders, sir? No, Vale turned back to the window. Cobb knows his business. He'll bring her back when the moment's right, not before. There's no profit in rushing a thing that only needs patience. A pause. Patience is the entire art of it, Corbett. Any fool can take a thing by force. It takes a man of some refinement to arrange matters, so that the thing simply arrives on its own, having concluded it had no better alternative. Yes, sir. The girl will come to understand her situation. Vale went on. Almost gentle now, almost thoughtful, the tone of a man discussing livestock rather than a person. The debt does not disappear because she's frightened of a wedding dress. The land does not stop needing my creek because she's found herself a temporary shelter with some rancher who fancies himself a protector. He allowed himself, finally, the barest thin smile. Men like that rarely understand what they've actually agreed to carry until the weight of it's already settled on their shoulders. He looked out at the snow a moment longer. Send word to Cobb, he said. Tell him not to move against the ranch. Not yet. Let the winter do what winter does out here, closes roads, closes options, closes a young woman's patience for cold and hardship rather more efficiently than any 6 riders could manage. The smile thinned further. Come the thaw, she'll be considerably more reasonable, and if Mr. Rourke has decided to make himself part of this matter, well, that's simply one more debt for somebody to eventually collect. Corbett bowed his way out of the study, grateful beyond measure to be dismissed, and did not see the way Cormac Vale's gaze lingered, a moment longer than it needed to, on the name he'd just heard spoken aloud for the first time in 4 years. Rourke. He had not thought of that particular complication in some while. Had believed, reasonably enough, that it had been settled, finished, filed away with the rest of the county's quiet inconveniences 4 winters back. It appeared the matter was not quite as finished as he'd assumed. Cormac Vale turned from the window, poured himself 2 fingers of good whiskey, and began, calm and unhurried, the way he approached everything of consequence, to consider precisely what to do about it. It arrived the way storms arrive in that country, without the courtesy of warning, with the flat, settled certainty of weather that has already made up its mind and does not particularly care whether you've made up yours. Silas watched it building in the north, pushed the horse harder, didn't make the ranch in time, made the old line cabin instead one he used during summer grazing. Single room, stone fireplace, wood stacked outside from October habit, whether he'd need it that particular year or not. The specific foresight of a man who'd learned the hard way that mountains didn't care about anybody's plans and never had. Is that shelter? Adeline asked, squinting through the first hard flakes, or is that a very convincing pile of logs? It's shelter. You sound uncertain. I sound like a man driving a wagon through a snowstorm. Get the horse. They got the horse into the lean-to, got the wagon alongside it, got themselves inside just as the sky opened up in earnest and started dumping snow, like it had a personal grievance against the both of them specifically. Adeline hadn't complained once the whole hard climb. Not about the pace, not about the cold, not about her ruined shoes, not about the fact she hadn't eaten since breakfast, which he only registered by noticing that she never once mentioned it. She sat on the cabin's single chair while he built the fire, and she looked around the small room with the eyes of a woman, taking careful inventory and finding it, against her better judgment, fully manageable. There's food in the wagon, he said. I'll get it. She was already standing. You've got the fire. She went out into the storm and came back with salt pork and flour and coffee and 2 of the blankets, and she had the pork sliced and in the pan before he'd gotten the fire fully caught, which he noticed. and said nothing about. Filed it away with everything else. They ate. The storm hammered the cabin walls, steady, relentless, and he'd braced himself for questions, the kind that come after a morning like theirs. The emotional accounting a person does once the danger's passed and the fears got nowhere left to go but out into the open air. What he got instead was a woman eating her supper and scraping the pan clean with the plain, practiced efficiency of someone who had been taking care of herself, entirely alone, for a good deal, longer than 22 years ought to require of anybody. "You're very quiet," she said, after a while. "I'm always quiet." "No, this is a different quiet. This is the quiet of a man deciding what to say something." He looked at her. "You've known me one day. I'm perceptive," she said. "It's one of my better qualities. Ask anybody." "Ask who?" "You've been running from everybody who might vouch for you." "That's fair," she admitted. "Ask my mare then. She liked me fine." "You don't have a mare." "I did before this week ruined nearly everything I owned." She looked at the fire. "So, are you going to say the thing?" He looked at the fire, too, easier than looking at her. "Thank you," he said finally, "for not asking questions on the road. You were telling me," he added, "in your own time." She almost smiled at that. "Didn't quite. Look back at the flames instead. My mother used to say the right person asks the right question at the right moment," she said, "and the wrong person asks all of them at once." He looked at the fire, too, because it was easier than looking straight at her. "What was the right question?" She never said. A pause. "I think she meant I'd know it when I heard it." He thought about that. Thought about a man who'd learned to live alone in a house, built for more than one person, who'd stopped asking questions a long while back because there'd been nobody left standing around to ask them of. He looked back at her across the fire. "Did you eat this morning?" he said. She looked up, surprised. "No," that, he said, was the right question. 6 hours too late, she almost laughed. It started, faltered, started again, and finished, and it changed her whole face when it finally landed, and Silas Rourke looked hard at the fire, because looking at her directly, when she smiled, like that was something he was going to need considerable time to work up to. "You should smile more," she said. "You've got a decent one hidden somewhere under all that composure." "I'll take that under advisement." "You say that like a man who has no intention of doing anything about it." "Observant," he said. "You'd make a fair lawyer yourself." "I'd make a terrible lawyer. I have opinions about everything, and no patience for people who don't share them." She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What was your brother's name?" The question landed soft, but it landed. "Micah," he said. "Micah Rourke." She said it slow, like she was setting it somewhere safe to keep. "What happened to him?" "Accident," Silas said. "Flat." "You don't believe that." He looked at her, sharp, surprised. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," she said. "I've spent 2 weeks reading through papers looking for the truth, underneath a story somebody built on purpose. I know what it looks like on a person's face when they're saying the official version instead of the real one." He didn't answer that. Not right away. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the cabin's old chinking and whistled through it, thin and cold, and the fire cracked and settled. And for a long minute, neither one of them said anything at all. "Not tonight," he said finally. "That's not a story for tonight." "All right," she said. "Simple. No push behind it. When it is, I'll be listening." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest loosened, just slightly, just enough to notice. And he didn't have a name for that either, and he put another log on the fire instead of reaching for one. Silas woke before dawn out of habit, not necessity. The storm had thinned to a hush outside, snow still coming down but softer now, like it had finished saying whatever it came to say. He lay still, a moment, listening to Adeline's breathing across the small room, even and slow, and let himself feel, for exactly 1 second, the strangeness of not being alone in a place he'd spent 4 years building his whole life around being alone in. Then he got up, fed the fire, went out to check on the horse. The lean-to had held, the wagon had held. The world outside was white in every direction, blinding and clean, the particular quiet a landscape gets after it's finished proving a point it didn't especially need to prove. He was coming back around the side of the cabin, arms full of the last split logs, when he stopped. Tracks, half-filled, with fresh snow, but recent. Coming up from the tree line to the east, the direction they'd ridden in from. Not deep, 1 horse, maybe 2. Somebody had come close in the night and gone again, or was still out there, watching. He stood a second, log in his arms, breath fogging in front of his face, running the possibilities the way he ran through most things, slow, methodical, calm on the outside, no matter what was doing somersaults underneath. Could have been a stray off the Hendricks spread, wandered loose from its picket line in the storm. Could have been nothing at all, snowdrift playing tricks on old ruts nobody'd used in weeks. Or it could have been one of Vale's men, sharp enough to guess which back roads led where, patient enough to sit a horse in a tree line half the night just to confirm a hunch he wasn't ready to act on yet. He didn't wake her to tell her. Not yet. No sense handing somebody a fear that might turn out to be nothing at all, but he banked the thought the way he banked everything. Filed it, kept it close, where he could reach it again if he needed it. They stayed at the cabin through the worst of it, left the next morning at first light. The sky scoured pale and clean the way it gets after heavy snow, everything sharp-edged and blinding, bright. The going was slow. The mountain road wasn't built for a loaded wagon in fresh drift, and twice Silas got down to lead the horse through a bad stretch by hand, boots soaked clean through, breath coming in short, hard bursts. Adeline didn't sit idle for either stretch. Walked alongside on the second one hand on the wagon's side rail for balance, saying nothing, matching his pace like it was the most natural arrangement in the world. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He didn't argue, didn't know quite how to, and didn't try very hard to learn on the spot. "You're stubborn," he said after a while. "I've been called worse, usually by people who meant it as an insult, and I chose to take as a compliment." "That's so. It's a survival skill," she said. "You'd be amazed how far a person can get on stubborn alone when the alternative's giving up." He glanced at her. Something in that landed harder than she probably meant it to. They crested the last ridge before noon, and the Rourke Ranch came into view below them, the house sitting solid in its clearing, smoke long since dead in the chimney, snow already a foot deep across the yard, the barn roof holding its white like it had been patiently waiting for this exact morning to make its case. Adeline stopped walking. Just for a second. "Looked at it. It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Built for more than one," Silas said, then wished immediately he hadn't said it quite like that. Too much truth packed into too few words said before he'd fully meant to say any of it out loud. She looked at him, looked at the house. "Your brother," she said, not a question. "He drew the plans before I ever laid eyes on them," Silas said. "A house ought to have room to grow into. I told him that was a strange notion for two bachelors to be building around." A pause. Something tightened briefly in his jaw. Gone as fast as it came, he laughed at that. "Told me I'd understand eventually." "Did you?" "Not until yesterday," he said, and didn't explain any further, and clicked the reins, and the wagon started down the last slope toward the house, and neither one of them said another word the rest of the way down. They got the wagon into the barn, got the horse settled and blanketed, got the fire in the house going, and Silas showed her through the rooms with the plain, unadorned efficiency of a man who understood that clutter cost time, and time wasn't a thing wasted lightly on a working ranch. The house was clean, organized, and missing, unmistakably, that distinct texture a place takes on when more than one person's habits have shaped it over more than a season. She noticed. Didn't say anything about it. He noticed her noticing. Didn't say anything about that either. "This is the kitchen," he said. "Obviously." "I gathered. That's the stove. It smokes if you don't clear the flue every week or so." "Noted. That's the pantry. It's mostly flour and salt pork, because that's mostly what a man alone eats." "A tragedy," she said. "I'll see what I can do about it." He gave her a look. She gave it right back. Unbothered, and something in him wanted, briefly and inconveniently, to smile. He showed her the spare room, his brother's room, unused 4 years, kept exactly the way he kept everything. Clean. Untouched. A held breath of a room. She set her small bag down on the chair by the window, looked around slowly. "I'll pay my keep," she said. "You don't need to." "I will," she said, turning to face him fully now. "I'm not a guest here. I'm somebody who needs to stay till the pass opens, and while I do," he looked at her a long moment. "Ranch runs fine with one," he said. "I know," she said. "It'd run better with two." Neither one looked away first. "There's a mare in the east stall," he said finally. "Hurt her left foreleg last week. Been managing it. Second pair of hands wouldn't hurt anything. I'll look at her come morning," Adeline said. He nodded. Turned to go start on supper. Behind him, he heard her open her small bag, heard the soft sounds of a person unpacking a life that had until 2 days prior fit into something noticeably larger than a cloth sack in a borrowed room. He didn't see what she took out, didn't know, not yet, that folded inside a spare petticoat were 2 documents pages she'd snatched off her mother's writing desk in the last frantic minute before she'd run, without fully understanding, at the time, why her hands had reached for those particular papers, and no others in the room. He didn't know that one of those pages carried handwriting he'd recognize, on sight, in any light, on any page, because it had signed birthday letters and ranch ledgers, and the back of a photograph he still kept tucked in a drawer he didn't open, often. His brother's handwriting. He didn't know that yet. Went to start supper instead, snow falling steady outside the window, and somewhere out past the tree line, half a day's ride back the way they'd come, 3 of Cormac Vale's riders sat their horses in a line and watched smoke finally rise from a chimney they'd spent the better part of a cold, thankless night trying to find. The lead rider, a lean man named Ezra Cobb, who had ridden for Vale 9 years and had learned, in that time, exactly how much of his conscience he was willing to spend on any given job, and exactly how much he intended to keep for himself, sat his horse at the tree line and stood smoked for a long while, without saying a word. Beside him, a second rider shifted in his saddle. Young, newer to the work, and not yet fully broken to it. "That's the Rourke place," he said. "You sure that's the one?" "I'm sure," Cobb said. "You know the man?" Cobb didn't answer right away. Something moved behind his eyes, old, unpleasant, half-buried, the kind of thing a man folds up small on purpose, the way you'd fold a letter you don't much want to read again, but can't quite bring yourself to burn either. "I knew his brother," Cobb said finally, flat. Final, the particular flat that told the younger rider, without a single further word, that the subject was closed for business. "His brother? Dead 4 years, Cobb said. Ain't got a thing to do with why we're out here." Except it did. Cobb knew it did, the way a man knows a wound's still open even after the skin's grown back smooth and pale over the top of it, lying convincingly to everybody who looks, including, on his better days, himself. He turned his horse. "We don't move tonight," he said. "Mr. Vale wants this handled careful, not rushed, not sloppy. And if she's in there?" Cobb looked back once more at the smoke, rising thin and steady into the white Wyoming sky, curling up from a chimney that belonged to a dead man's brother, on land a dead man had once walked, drawing up plans for a house he never got to finish living inside of. "She's in there," Cobb said quietly. "Questions what we do about it, and what it costs the both of us when we finally do." He turned his horse toward the tree line, and the others fell in behind him, and the snow closed soft and silent in their wake, erasing every trace of the 3 men who had ridden up and watched, met, and gone again. Supper was quiet at first. Not uncomfortable quiet, the other kind. The kind that happens when 2 people are both working out how much of themselves they're willing to hand across a table to a stranger. Adeline broke it first. "You don't talk much, I've been told." "By who?" "Cattle, mostly. They're not great conversationalists." That startled a laugh out of her short, surprised at itself. She covered her mouth like she hadn't meant to let it escape. "That was almost a joke," she said. "I have a few. I ration them. Like the coffee. How many do you have left this winter?" "Depends how long you're planning to stay and how much you keep provoking me. Then I'll pace myself," she said. "Wouldn't want to use up your whole supply in one evening." He looked at her over the rim of his cup, and something in his chest did that thing again, the thing without a name, and he looked back down at his plate before it could finish happening a second time. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he said, nodding at the pan. "Growing up in a seamstress's house, my mother believed a woman ought to know how to feed herself, whether or not a man ever showed up to do it for her." A small private smile. She had opinions about a great many things. Feeding yourself was one of the milder ones. "Sounds like a formidable woman." She was. Adeline's voice didn't waver exactly, but something underneath it went careful, the way a person walks careful over ice they're not wholly sure will hold. "She'd have liked you, I think. Or she'd have interrogated you within an inch of your life before deciding." There wasn't much middle ground with her. "Which would I have gotten?" Adeline said. "Definitely. The interrogation. You've got the look of a man who the first 3 questions on principle and passed the rest out of sheer stubbornness." High praise. It was meant as exactly that. They ate. The fire popped. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady, patient, and somewhere in the middle of the meal, Silas realized he'd stopped bracing for the silence to turn heavy, the way it always had before, the way silence in that house had learned to sit like a third person at the table since Micah died. It didn't feel like that tonight. He didn't examine why too closely. Some things a man learns not to poke at directly for fear of scaring them off. "Can I ask you something?" Adeline said. "Once the plates were cleared, you can ask. Why'd you say yes? Yesterday. In the wagon. You didn't know me. Didn't know if I was running from something I deserved or something I didn't." He thought about that a moment, turned the coffee cup slow between his hands. "You were hiding," he said finally. "Not running toward a fight. Hiding from one. Man who's done wrong doesn't usually hide quiet in the back of a stranger's wagon. He talks his way out, or he brazens it, or he doesn't run at all because he doesn't think he's done anything." He looked at her. "You didn't do any of that. You just went still and hoped. That's a lot of reading off one afternoon." "I've got time on my hands most days," he said. "Learn to read what's in front of me. It's mostly cattle and weather." "You were a nice change of subject." "I'll try not to take that as an insult." It wasn't one. She studied him a second, like she was deciding whether to believe that. Then, apparently, decided she did. "Thank you," she said. Quiet. Real. Nothing performed in it this time. For the wagon. For the road. For not asking me to be grateful about it every hour since. Wasn't looking for gratitude. "I know," she said. "That's rather the point." Morning came clear and hard-edged, the kind of cold that made the air feel like it had corners. Silas found Adeline already out at the barn before he'd finished his coffee, standing at the east stall talking low and even to the injured mare, one hand resting flat against the animal's shoulder, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "She's favoring it less than you said," Adeline called, without turning around. "You've known her one morning." "I know horses better than I know most people," she said. "It's a shorter conversation usually, and considerably more honest." She ran her hand down the mare's forelegs, slow, testing. The mare didn't flinch. "Whoever wrapped this did a fair job. Bit tight through here, though. You want it snug, not strangled." Duly noted. "Your brother teach you?" The question came sideways, easy, like it wasn't loaded with anything at all. He wondered if she'd learned to ask things that way on purpose, or if it just came natural to her, the way stubborn came natural. "Some of it," Silas said. "Rest I figured out on my own. Wasn't much choice. Once I was the only one left figuring." He sounds like he was good at explaining things. He was good at everything, Silas said, and heard the old, worn edge in his own voice, the one that had been there 4 years and hadn't smoothed down any with time, the way everybody kept promising him it would. Law, horses, people. He had a way of making a hard thing sound simple, right up until you tried it yourself and found out it wasn't. That why you don't talk about him? He didn't answer right away. "It's not that I don't," he said finally. "It's that I don't know how to talk about him without it turning into talking about how he died. And I've never much cared for that version of the conversation." "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I meant what I said in the cabin, I know." She went back to the mare's leg, unwrapping the old dressing with quick, careful hands, and Silas stood there, a moment longer than he needed to, watching her work, thinking about how strange it was that a woman he'd known 2 days already knew more about the shape of his silence than most people who'd known him his whole life. "What's her name?" Adeline asked, nodding at the mare. "Doesn't have one. Every animal has a name. Some of them just haven't been given theirs yet." She patted the mare's neck, thoughtful. "How long have you had her?" 3 years. 3 years and no name." "She answers to mare. That is not a name. That is a description." Adeline straightened, hands on her hips, surveying the animal with the serious consideration of a woman to make an important decision. "She's got a look about her, patient, but she'll bite you if you deserve it. I'm thinking Delilah. Delilah brought down a strong man through treachery, as I recall." "Exactly. Fitting, don't you think, given she's currently got you fetching wraps and holding her legs steady at 6 in the morning." Despite himself, Silas laughed. Actually laughed, short and surprised, the sound unfamiliar enough in his own chest that he nearly didn't recognize it as coming from him. "There it is," Adeline said, pleased with herself. "I knew you had one in there somewhere. Don't get used to it. Too late. I'm keeping count now. That's one." They finished with the mare, Delilah. Apparently, now and forevermore, and Silas showed her the rest of the barn while the morning chores went on around them, the milk cow, ancient and unbothered by nearly everything. The chickens, much more opinionated about the cold than the cow was. The tack room, so orderly in the particular way that told Adeline, without him saying so, that order was one of the few things Silas Rourke had left himself full control over these past 4 years. You keep a tidy operation, she said. Ranch runs tidy, or a man keeps things tidy because it's easier than sitting still long enough to feel whatever he's avoiding feeling. He looked at her, sharp, and she met the look without flinching, without apologizing for it either. That a professional opinion? That's an observation from a woman who spent the last 2 weeks cleaning out her dead mother's sewing room from top to bottom rather than sit in a quiet house by herself, Adeline said. I know the symptom because I've got it too. Takes one to recognize one, generally. He didn't have an answer for that one ready. Filed it away instead, the way he filed most things that landed too close to true. Come on, he said finally. I'll show you the rest before you freeze standing here diagnosing me. I charge for diagnoses, you know. Add it to my tab. Your tab's getting rather long, Mr. Rourke. I'm good for it, he said, and meant it in more ways than the conversation strictly called for, and neither one of them commented further on that, though something passed between them anyway, quiet and unspoken, the exact kind of understanding that doesn't need a name yet to already be real. That evening, after the second supper passed easier than the first, Adeline set about mending what she could of her few belongings, a torn seam in her spare petticoat, worn thin from 2 days of hard travel, and Silas, restless in the way he got most evenings, offered to fetch her sewing kit from the wagon, still loaded in the barn. He found the small bag where she'd left it, found the sewing kit easy enough, and found, tucked in beside it, folded twice and gone soft at the creases, 2 pages of paper that had clearly been carried a good while before they'd ever landed in that bag. He shouldn't have looked. Knew that, even as his hand was already unfolding the first page, the way a man knows a great many things half a second too late to matter. The paper was old. The ink had faded some at the folds, and the handwriting, his stomach went cold before his mind had finished catching up to why. He knew that hand, knew the particular slant of the capital letters, the way the R always came out a little too big, like the writer had never fully broken the habit of signing things with more confidence than the rest of the sentence deserved. He'd seen that handwriting on birthday letters, on ranch ledgers, on the back of a photograph he kept in a drawer he didn't open often, because opening it cost more than most days could afford. Micah, his brother's handwriting, on a letter addressed to a woman named Constance Marsh, dated 4 years back. 4 years, near enough to the week his brother had died. Silas stood in the cold barn a long time, the page trembling slightly in his hand, not from the wind. He read it twice before he could make himself believe what it said. His brother, who was supposed to have died in a fall no more complicated than bad luck, and a spooked horse had written to Adeline's mother, warning her, plain as anything, that the terms of her credit weren't what she believed them to be, that the man extending it had done so with a purpose that had nothing to do with kindness. Micah had known, months before he died. Micah had known exactly what Cormac Vale was building, and had tried, in his own careful lawyer's hand, to warn a seamstress in Larkspur Hollow before it was too late. And 4 years later, his brother was gone, and the debt had gone on growing anyway, straight into the exact trap Micah had tried to stop. Silas didn't hear the barn door, didn't hear Adeline's footsteps in the straw, not until she was standing right beside him, following his gaze down to the paper in his hand, and going very still herself when she saw what it was. She started. That's my brother's handwriting, Silas said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. This letter, addressed to your mother, dated 4 years back. Adeline's face went pale in the lamplight. I didn't know, she said. I swear to you, I didn't know what was on those pages. I grabbed what I could off her desk in the last minute before I ran. I didn't have time to read anything. I knew I'd need something. And these were closest. He tried to warn her, Silas said, staring at the page like it might rearrange itself into something less true if he looked hard enough. Before he died, he knew about Vale. He knew what the credit... Silas, he never told me, Silas said, and something in his chest cracked open, old and raw and 4 years overdue. Not one word. Whole last month of his life, and he never once mentioned any of it. He looked up at her, found her watching him with an expression that had nothing performed in it, at all, no calculation, no careful arithmetic, just plain, unguarded understanding, the look of someone who knew exactly what it cost to find out a dead man had been carrying something alone. "He died 3 weeks after this letter's dated," Silas said quietly. "They told me it was his horse. Told me it was bad footing on the North Trail. Plain and simple. Nothing more to it than that." The wind moved outside, low and steady against the barn boards, and Silas Rourke stood in the lamplight holding proof, for the first time in 4 years, that the story he'd been told about his brother's death might never have been the whole of it at all. "I don't think it was his horse," he said. Adeline didn't say anything, just reached out, slow, and put her hand over his, the one holding the letter firm, warm, the first thing in 4 years that had ever quite managed to hold that particular grief still long enough for him to look straight at it. They sat like that a long while, neither one in any hurry to move, or speak, or break whatever thing had settled over the barn along with the lamplight and the cold. "What was the second page?" Adeline asked finally, gently, nodding at the papers still in his hand. Silas had almost forgotten there was a second page at all. He unfolded it, slow, and found not a letter this time, but a list. Figures, dates, notations in his brother's careful hand, a record, plain as anything, of the actual interest Cormac Vale had been charging against the true rate he'd quoted, laid out side by side like evidence a man builds when he intends, eventually, to bring it in front of somebody who could do something about it. He wasn't just warning her, Silas said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, the way understanding does when a person isn't ready for the whole of it at once. He was building a case against Vale. 3 weeks before he died. 3 weeks before he died. The words sat heavy in the cold barn air. Silas looked at the page a long moment, then folded it back along its old creases, careful, like it might tear if he handled it wrong, like it was something considerably more fragile than paper. "I spent 4 years telling myself it was just bad luck," he said. "A horse, a bad trail, a man who wasn't careful enough on a night he should have stayed home." His voice had gone rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "I never once let myself ask why he was out on that trail at all, that late, in that weather. Never asked where he'd been coming from. Where do you think he'd been coming from?" Silas looked down at the letter again, at his brother's handwriting, addressed to a dead woman, about a debt that had somehow, 4 years later, and against every reasonable odd, landed a stranger in the back of his wagon. "I think," he said slowly, "he'd been coming from somewhere he shouldn't have gone alone." Adeline's hand tightened over his. "We don't have to decide anything tonight," she said. "It's late. You've had a shock, and I've had rather a large one myself. And neither one of us is thinking clearly enough right now to be trusted with big decisions. That's a fair assessment. I'm full of those." A small, tired smile passed between them, not the easy kind from supper. Something quieter, forged in the last hour rather than simply found there. Silas folded both pages carefully and tucked them inside his coat, close, the way a man keeps something he's afraid of losing twice. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold, and the fire's better company than a barn. Is that an invitation or an order? Take it however gets you moving faster." "I'm freezing." She laughed, soft, surprised again by her own capacity for it, after everything the last 2 days had handed her, and they walked back to the house together through snow that had gone from falling to nearly still, the whole white world around them, holding its breath. Inside, the fire had burned low. Silas fed it back to life while Adeline settled into the single good chair, and for a while neither one of them said much of anything, the two of them, simply sitting with the fact of what they now knew, and what it might mean, and how much bigger the winter ahead had just become. "He'd have liked you," Silas said eventually, apropos of nothing and everything. "Micah, he had a soft spot for people who didn't back down easy. I'll take that as a compliment too. It was meant as exactly that." Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and the sky above the ranch had gone the peculiar hard, clear black that comes after a long storm finishes saying its piece. Stars scattered thick and cold across every inch of it. Somewhere out past the tree line, half a day's ride toward Larkspur Hollow, Cormac Vale sat in his study going over wedding arrangements that had failed to arrange themselves, and did not yet know that a dead lawyer's handwriting had just resurfaced, 4 years late, and markedly more dangerous than he could have accounted for. And inside the Rourke ranch house, a man who had spent 4 years learning to prefer silence, sat across the fire from a woman he'd known exactly 2 days, and understood, moved with the particular clarity that only arrives at the end of a very long day, that the life he'd built around being alone had just quietly, irreversibly, begun to change shape. Neither one of them said so out loud. Some things, that early, don't need saying. Later, long after the fire had burned down to embers, and Adeline had said her goodnights and retreated to Micah's old room, Silas sat alone a while longer, the two folded pages resting on the table in front of him, and thought about the shape of the 4 years he's just spent believing a simple story. A horse, a trail, bad luck, and nothing more complicated underneath it. He thought about his brother sitting at this very table, that furrow between his eyebrows, saying, "You ever notice how the folks who need help most are usually the ones who get offered the worst kind of it, dressed up to look like the best?" He thought about a woman 6 miles east, in a house he'd never once set foot inside, who had built an entire life's worth of quiet, patient cruelty and called it business. And he thought, for the first time in 4 years, not about the grief of losing his brother, but about something considerably closer to purpose, the plain, steady, unhurried resolve of a man who had just been handed, however late, however unwillingly, the first real thread of a truth he intended, eventually, to follow all the way to its end. Outside, the ranch sat quiet under its fresh blanket of snow, holding, for one more night, everything it did not yet know was coming. The first note appeared on the kitchen table 3 days after the letter. Silas found it propped against the coffee tin, small hand, neat, nothing fancy about it, no flourish, just plain fact laid out plain. Mended the curtain in the front room. Torn since before I got here, I'd guess. Didn't ask. Just fixed it. He stood there a full minute holding that scrap of paper like it weighed far more than paper had any right to weigh. Because it did. Because a torn curtain was nothing. A torn curtain was the kind of thing a man walked past 400 times and stopped seeing on the 200th. Except somebody had seen it. Somebody had looked at his house, his tired, half-lived-in house, and decided it deserved fixing. He wrote back that evening. Left it under the same tin. North wall of the barn needs another cord of wood before the deep cold sets in if you're looking for something to occupy your hands. Not romantic. Not meant to be. Just true and useful, and the only language he had any real fluency in. She answered the next morning. Already started. It's dull. You should be ashamed. He wasn't ashamed. He was, against every instinct he had left, something close to happy, and that scared him considerably more than the dull axe did. November came in hard and stayed. The kind of cold that turned breath to fog before it cleared the lips, that made the water trough breaking every morning without fail, that settled into the bones of the house and stayed there no matter how high the fire climbed. The ranch didn't care about grief or letters or dead brother's handwriting turning up folded in petticoats. The ranch needed feeding, same as always. Cattle needed hay. Fence needed checking, even in snow, especially in snow, because a downed rail in a storm was a hole a man wouldn't find again till spring, by which time half his herd could have wandered through it. And frozen someplace he'd never think to look. Silas worked. Adeline worked alongside him, more often than not, and it took him the better part of 2 weeks to stop being surprised by that fact every single morning. "You don't have to be out here," he told her, more than once. Genuinely meant it, every time. "I know," she said. Every time, with the same flat patience of someone repeating an answer to a question that hadn't gotten any more interesting since the first time he asked it. "I'm out here anyway. It's 14 degrees, I've noticed. Your hands will freeze, they're already frozen. Might as well be frozen usefully." He gave up arguing around the 3rd week, realized, somewhere in there, that arguing had never actually been the point, that some deep, stubborn part of him kept raising the objection, just to hear her shoot it down again, just for the distinctive pleasure of watching her not budge an inch, which was new, which was, if he was honest with himself, and he tried to be, mostly, when nobody else was around to witness the honesty, the first genuinely new thing to happen inside him in 4 years. The first real trouble of that November came on a Tuesday. A storm blowing in faster than the sky had promised that morning. A dozen head of cattle still out on the far pasture when it hit. Silas was already saddled and moving before he'd fully thought it through, and found Adeline right behind him, already pulling her coat tight, already reaching for the second horse, without asking whether she should. "You don't have to come," he shouted over the rising wind. "I know," she shouted back. "I'm coming anyway." There wasn't time to argue the point properly, not with the sky going the particular ugly gray-green that meant business, Not with a dozen head of cattle somewhere out in it that would freeze solid by morning if they weren't found and moved. They found them scattered along the tree line, spooked and stubborn, and it took the better part of 2 brutal hours snow driving sideways, visibility down to a few dozen feet, Adeline's voice hoarse from shouting commands at animals, with no particular interest in obeying before the last of the herd was finally pushed into the shelter of the near pasture and the gate swung shut behind them. They rode back to the house half frozen, snow-caked, barely able to feel their own hands on the reins, and it wasn't until they were both standing dripping in the kitchen, stripping off frozen gloves with fingers that had stopped working properly, somewhere in the last hour, that either one of them found breath enough to speak. "You could have stayed inside," Silas said, working his numb fingers, teeth chattering hard enough to slur the words slightly. "So could you," Adeline shot back. "Man could have hired help for exactly this kind of work instead of insisting on doing it alone for 4 straight years. Man did hire help." Gus was his sister. "Man could have hired more than one person, is my point. Man didn't think he needed anybody," Silas said, quieter now, something honest slipping in under the chattering teeth. "Turns out he was wrong about that." Adeline looked at him a long moment, snowmelt dripping off both of them onto the kitchen floor, cheeks bright red from cold and exertion both. "Turns out," she agreed. "He was." Neither one moved to build up the fire right away, just stood there a moment longer, half frozen and breathing hard and entirely, thoroughly alive, in a way that had very little to do with the weather at all. Gus arrived on the ranch the 2nd week of November, same as he did every year, driving a rickety cart down from his sister's place in the Bighorn foothills, where he wintered his own small stock of goats and spent the rest of the year, as he liked to put it, getting altogether too much unsolicited advice from a woman who's been bossing me since before either of us had teeth. Augustus Pruett, 61 years old, built like a fence post that had seen some weather, with a white beard he trimmed with kitchen shears once a season, whether it needed it or not, and a way of talking that made every sentence sound like the setup to a joke, even when it wasn't one. He'd worked the Rourke place on and off since before Silas was old enough to hold a rope proper. Had known Micah since the boy was drawing house plans in the dirt with a stick, dreaming out loud about a place with room enough to grow into. He took one look at Adeline standing in the yard, sleeves rolled, hauling a feed bucket like she'd been born to it, and one look at Silas standing a careful 3 feet away, pretending not to watch her do it, and said, without so much as a hello first, "Well, ain't this an interesting development?" "Gus." Silas. Gus climbed down off his cart slow, joints complaining audibly the whole way. "You gonna introduce me, or am I meant to guess?" "Adeline Marsh," Silas said. "She's staying the winter." "Is she?" "Circumstances." "Circumstances." Gus repeated the word like he was turning it over, checking it for weight, finding it a good deal lighter than the situation clearly warranted. That the same circumstances got half of Larkspur Hollow, whispering about a wedding that didn't happen and a bride that up and vanished. Silas went still. Adeline set down her bucket, straightened, met the old man's eyes square, no flinching in it. "Those circumstances exactly," she said. Gus studied her a long moment. Then slow, something in his weathered face cracked open into a grin. "Good," he said. "Never did care for Cormacvale. Man's got a handshake like a dead fish and a heart to match." He hefted his own bag off the cart, waved off Silas's offer to help with the specific irritation of a man who'd been hauling his own weight for 60 years and saw no reason to stop now. "Well, come on then. Show me where I'm sleeping. And somebody tell me what in the hell's actually going on around here, because I did not drive 4 days through this cold to be left guessing." They told him that night, over supper, the whole of it, the wagon, the wedding, the debt, the letter with Micah's handwriting on it. Gus went very quiet during that last part. Quiet in a way that didn't suit him. Quiet that sat wrong on a man who usually filled silence, the way water fills a low spot in the ground, automatically, without particular effort. "Gus," Silas said, watching him, "you've gone strange on me." The old man didn't cough cup, slow, between 2 weathered hands, staring into it like it might have something useful to say if he waited long enough. "There's something I never told you," he said finally. "About the night your brother died." The kitchen went very still. Even the fire seemed to hold itself quieter, waiting. "Gus." Silas's voice came out low, careful, the voice of a man approaching something he wasn't sure he wanted found. "What are you talking about?" "I was out that night." Gus said, checking a fence line down near the north trail. Same trail they found Micah's horse come back without him from. He set the cup down, hands not quite steady. I saw riders, 3 of them, maybe 4, hard to say for certain in that dark, moving fast away from the trail, toward town. Wasn't thinking much of it at the time. Men ride at night for all kinds of reasons. You never mentioned this. No, Gus said. Simple? Heavy, I didn't. 4 years, Gus. Something raw had crept into Silas's voice now. Something that had been buried a long time and didn't come up easy. 4 years, and you never once. I was scared, boy. The old man's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to show the years of carrying it. I recognized one of the horses, big bay gelding, white sock on the near foreleg, distinctive as anything. I'd seen that horse plenty of times before, tied up outside the Vale place, doing errands for a man who does not take kindly to folks who ask questions he doesn't want asked. Silas's jaw had gone tight enough to ache. You think Vale's men were on that trail the same night? I think, Gus said, slow, careful, choosing each word like it cost him something to spend it, that a horse spooking clean off a trail your brother had ridden 100 times before, in weather that wasn't half as bad as some he'd ridden through without incident, is a strange kind of accident to happen on the very same night. I saw Vale's riders coming off that exact trail in an awful hurry to be somewhere else. Why didn't you say something? To the sheriff. And tell them what? Gus looked up, eyes hard now, old grief showing plain underneath the hardness. That I saw some riders, at night, from a distance, and I think one of the horses looked familiar. Sheriff in this county answers to money same as everybody else does, and Vale's got more of it than God. I had no proof. Nothing but a bad feeling and a dead man I couldn't bring back no matter how loud I hollered about it. His hands had curled into fists on the table, old knuckles gone white. I made my peace with staying quiet a long time ago. Told myself it wouldn't have changed anything even if I had spoken up. Did you believe that? Gus didn't answer for a long moment. No, he said finally. Not one single day of it. But quiet was the only thing I had that felt safe, and safe mattered more to me than it should have. Adeline reached across the table, put her hand over the old man's fist, gentle, the same way she'd done for Silas in the barn 3 nights before. You're telling us now, she said. That's not nothing. It's 4 years late is what it is. It's still not nothing, she said again, firm this time, and something in Gus's shoulders eased. Just slightly, the particular relief of a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long. He'd half forgotten it wasn't just part of his own bones. Silas sat with his own hands flat on the table, staring at nothing, running the whole of it back, through his mind the letter, the ledger of true rates against reported ones. And now, this, a horse with a white sock. Riders moving fast away from a dead man's trail, the same night his brother's luck ran out, in a manner that had never quite sat right with anybody who'd known him well enough to know how careful a rider he'd always been. He was murdered, Silas said. Quiet, final. The words landing in the kitchen like something physical, something with weight and edges. My brother was murdered, and it's taken me 4 years to hear a single person say it out loud. Nobody argued with him. Nobody could. Gus sat quiet a moment longer, something working behind his weathered face, some second calculation finishing itself out before he spoke again. There's more, he said. Silas looked up sharp. More. I kept something. Didn't know why exactly at the time. Just felt wrong to throw it out. Gus pushed back from the table, slow, joints protesting, and made his way toward the door. Come on. It's out in the barn. Been out there 4 years, tucked up in the rafters where I figured nobody'd think to look, including me most days. They followed him out into the cold, lantern light bobbing across the snow, and up into the loft of the main barn, where Gus dug through a stack of old horse blankets until his hand found what he was looking for, a small oilcloth bundle, tied with twine gone brittle with age. He unwrapped it, careful, and handed Silas a single torn page. Half a survey map, the paper yellowed, one edge ragged, where it had been ripped rather than cut. Found this caught in the brush, down near the creek that runs through the marsh property, Gus said. Week or 2 before Micah died, if memory serves right. Never made much sense of it at the time. Figured it was just some surveyor's trash, blown loose in a wind. Silas held the page up to the lantern light. Adeline leaned in close beside him, and together they studied it, lines and figures, a rough diagram of the creek and the land surrounding it, and there, in one corner, with a notation in a hand neither of them recognized, diversion channel, proposed pending acquisition of southern parcel. That's not a survey for water rights, Adeline said slowly, understanding arriving cold and clear. That's a plan, an actual engineering plan, for diverting the creek before he even had legal claim to the land it ran through. Dated, Silas said, pointing to a small notation in the corner. Look, dated 8 months before your mother's debt was even called due. The full weight of it settled over the three of them at once, silent and enormous. He didn't wait to see if he'd get the land, Silas said. He was already planning what he'd do with it, before he'd even finished building the trap that was going to hand it to him. And if this page was already drawn up and circulating 8 months before, Adeline said, Micah could well have seen it, or heard of it. Might be exactly what set him digging into the debt structure in the first place. Which means whoever tore this page loose, Silas said slowly, looking at the ragged edge, tore it away from something bigger. A complete set of plans, filed somewhere, maybe in Vale's own study, if we're fortunate enough to ever get close to it. Gus wrapped the torn page back in its oilcloth, careful, reverent almost, the way a man handles something he's finally allowed himself to stop being afraid of. 4 years I sat on that, he said. Told myself it was nothing. Told myself a torn page proved nothing on its own. He looked at Silas, old eyes steady now, resolve settled into them at last. I don't believe that anymore. Haven't, not since tonight. Neither do I, Silas said, and folded the oilcloth bundle carefully into his coat, alongside the 2 letters that had started this whole unraveling 3 nights before. December moved slow, the way winter months do out on a working ranch, each day nearly identical to the one before it. Chores, meals, a certain rhythm 2 people and 1 old ranch hand settle into when the world outside has narrowed down to whatever fits inside a fence line and a few miles of snow-choked road. Except it wasn't identical. Not really. Because underneath the sameness, something had shifted and kept shifting, quiet and slow, as the accumulating drifts against the north wall of the barn. Silas began going through Micah's old office in the evenings, a small room off the back of the house that had sat mostly untouched for years, files and law books gathering the particular dust that settles on things a person can't bear to disturb and can't bear to throw away either. Adeline helped. Gus helped when his knees allowed for the kind of sitting and sorting the work required. And slowly, page by page, ledger by ledger, a picture began assembling itself out of the wreckage of a dead man's paperwork. Micah hadn't just written 1 letter to Constance Marsh. He'd written 3. It turned out, over the course of 2 months, each one more urgent than the last, each one carefully documenting the gap between the interest rate Vale had quoted verbally and the rate written into the actual notes. He was building something, Adeline said one evening, spreading the pages across the desk in careful, chronological order. Look at this. Dates, figures, cross-references to at least 2 other families besides my mother. She looked up, something fierce and sad both moving across her face at once. It wasn't just us. Vale's done this before. My mother wasn't his first. How many others? Hard to say for certain, but at least the Whitmore place, going by these notes, and something about a smaller parcel near the Coulter claim. She traced a line of Micah's cramped handwriting with 1 finger, careful, like touching it too hard might make it disappear. Your brother was putting together a case, a real one, enough to take to a federal marshal if he'd had time to finish it. He didn't get the chance to finish it. No, she said softly, but we might. She was quiet a moment, still looking down at the letters, and something in her face shifted, softened, the fierce determination giving way briefly to something more fragile underneath it. My mother kept a Bible, she said, unprompted, quiet. Small thing, worn soft at the corners. She used to write in the margins, not scripture notes. Exactly. Just thoughts. Things she wanted to remember. I found an entry from around the time your brother's first letter would have arrived. She reached into her small bag, produced the Bible carefully, opened it to a marked page, and read aloud, her voice gone soft and careful. A kind stranger has written to warn me my situation may be worse than I believed. I do not know whether to trust it. Trusting costs something when you have already lost so much, but so does refusing to look. Silas sat with that a moment, the weight of it settling slow. She trusted him, he said. Eventually, enough to keep his letters at least. Enough to keep them, Adeline agreed, but not enough to act on them in time. I think she was afraid. I think losing my father young, and then scraping by all those years afterward, had taught her that caution was safer than hope most days. She closed the Bible gently, held it against her chest a moment. I used to think that was wisdom. Now I wonder if it was just fear dressed up. Nicer might have both, Silas said. Sometimes there's not much daylight between the two. No, Adeline said. I suppose there isn't. She looked at him, something raw and honest in her expression. I don't want to make her mistake. I don't want to look away from a hard truth, because trusting it costs something. You haven't, Silas said. Not once that I've seen. Not yet, she said. Ask me again once we're standing in front of a federal marshal with everything we've got laid out on his desk, and Vale's lawyers circling like buzzards. That's when it'll actually cost something. We'll cross that when it comes, Silas said. For now we keep pulling the thread. Silas looked at her across the cluttered desk lamplight, catching the side of her face, papers scattered between them like the pieces of a puzzle. Neither one of them had asked to be handed, but both, somehow, had ended up determined to solve anyway, and felt something settle into place inside his chest. Not peace, exactly. Nothing that simple, but purpose, direction. The particular steadiness that comes when grief finally finds somewhere useful to point itself. We're going to need more, he said, more than his letters. More than Gus's memory of a horse with a white sock. 4 years gone. We'll get more, Adeline said. Certain. Unshakable. I didn't run halfway across this county in a stolen moment of courage just to sit quiet through the rest of it. He almost laughed. Stolen moment of courage. Is that what you're calling it now? What would you call it? Recklessness, he said. Pure, unfiltered recklessness. Dressed up nice for company. I prefer my version. I imagine you would. What exactly, she asked, more practical now, does a case like this need to actually hold up? You said your brother talked about federal marshals. What would he have told us to gather if he were the one sitting here instead of us guessing at it? Silas considered that seriously, drawing on scattered memory of dinner table conversations years gone, half-remembered legal talk he'd absorbed without ever expecting to need it. Documentation, he said slowly. Real numbers, side by side, the rate quoted against the rate written. Witnesses willing to say so under oath, not just willing to say so quiet. In a kitchen, where it cost them nothing to be believed. And something tying Vale directly to the fraud, not just benefiting from it after the fact, but ordering it, planning it. He tapped the torn survey page still resting on the desk beside the letters. This helps. Shows intent months before the debt was even called due. But it's not enough on its own. We need somebody willing to stand up in Cheyenne and say, out loud, under their own name, that Vale built this on purpose. Gus is willing, Adeline said. Gus is willing, Silas agreed. That's one thread. We need more. Something passed between them then, quick, warm, entirely unspoken, and Gus, watching from the doorway with an armful of split wood, and the patience of a man who'd seen this exact kind of thing happen before, and knew better than to interrupt it, simply cleared his throat, deposited the wood by the stove, and left the two of them to whatever they were building. In that cluttered little office, page by careful page, supplies ran low the third week of December, low enough that somebody had to risk the trip into Larkspur Hollow whether the timing suited anybody or not. Gus volunteered before Silas could open his mouth to claim the job himself. You're recognizable, Gus said, matter of fact, already pulling on his heaviest coat. Whole town knows your face, knows your wagon, and half of Vale's riders have had a good long look at both by now. Nobody looks twice at an old man buying flour. He was gone the better part of a day, and Silas spent most of it finding reasons to walk out to the gate and look down the empty road, an old habit he thought he'd broken years back, worrying over somebody the way he hadn't let himself worry over anybody since Micah. Gus returned near dusk, wagon loaded, expression carefully arranged into something that wasn't quite as steady as he was clearly trying to make it look. Trouble? Silas asked, before the old man had even climbed down. Nothing I couldn't handle. Gus busied himself with the harness, not meeting Silas's eyes directly. Ran into Ezra Cobb outside the mercantile. Man asked after you. Casual-like. Asked how the ranch was wintering, asked, real offhand, whether you'd had any visitors this season. Silas's whole body went still. What'd you tell him? Told him you were wintering, same as always. Told him the only visitor you'd had was me. Come down from my sister's place, same as every year. Gus finally looked up, something grim settling into the lines of his face. He didn't believe a word of it. could see it plain in his eyes. But he didn't push either. Just tipped his hat and rode off. Which is its own kind of message if you think about it right. What message is that he knows? Gus said quietly. And he's choosing not to act on it yet. Which means somebody's told him to wait. He hauled the last sack of flour off the wagon, shoulders set hard against whatever he was carrying that had nothing to do with flour at all. Vale's playing patient. That's worse than playing angry in my experience. Angry men make mistakes. Patient men wait for you to make yours. Adeline had come out onto the porch during the exchange, arms wrapped tight against the cold, face gone pale in the fading light. He knows I'm here, she said. Not a question. He's suspected for some while, most like Gus said, gentler now. Today just confirmed it for him proper. Nobody said much else that evening. Supper was quiet, the good kind of quiet from earlier weeks, replaced by something more watchful, more careful. 3 people suddenly aware all over again of exactly how much winter still stood between them and whatever was coming once the passes finally opened. Christmas came quiet. No church, the roads too choked with snow to risk the trip to Larkspur Hollow, and none of the 3 of them minding the absence much. Gus produced, from some corner of his cart, nobody had thought to inspect closely, a small bottle of good whiskey he'd apparently been saving since summer for an occasion he hadn't yet identified, and declared the occasion officially identified. They ate well, told stories, Gus mostly, about Micah as a boy, about a young Silas who'd once tried to teach himself to rope using the porch rail, and ended up flat on his back in the mud for his trouble, laughing so hard at his own failure that he'd had to be helped back up. He laughed like that. Adeline asked, watching Silas's face carefully as Gus told it. As a boy? Constantly, Gus said before Silas could answer for himself. Boy laughed at everything. Fell off that porch rail 4 separate times before he finally got the knack of it, and laughed harder each time than the last. I don't believe that. Ask him yourself. Adeline turned to Silas, eyebrow raised, waiting. It's mostly true, Silas admitted, something warm and a little embarrassed working its way across his face. Micah used to say I laughed easy as a boy. Said the ranch wore it off me slow, one bad winter at a time. He looked down at his cup. Hadn't thought about that particular memory in years. You should think about it more, Adeline said, quiet, gentle. No teasing left in it now. The parts that were easy, not just the parts that hurt. He looked up at her, and for a long moment, neither one said anything else. The fire cracking soft between them, Gus discreetly finding something urgent to attend to out by the stove that did not, strictly speaking, require his attention at all. Later, after Gus had turned in and the fire had burned down low, Adeline and Silas sat up a while longer, the way they'd started doing most nights. Not talking about much of anything in particular, just sitting, comfortable, the specific comfortable that takes considerable time to earn, and neither one of them had expected to find quite this fast. Can I tell you something, she said. You can. I wasn't planning on staying. Not really, not past the first week. She looked at the fire, not at him. I told myself I'd wait out the worst of the weather and then find some way east, somewhere Vale's name didn't mean anything to anybody. Start over clean where nobody knew the shape of what I'd run from. What changed? She considered the question a long moment, like she was testing several answers before settling on the one that was actually true. You left a note about a torn curtain, she said finally, instead of asking me a single question about my life, and I realized I hadn't been asked to explain myself once. Not fully. Not the way I kept bracing myself to be asked. You just handed me things to fix, and let me fix them, and treated the fixing like it mattered same as anything else around here. Mattered. She looked at him now, composed, unguarded in a way he hadn't quite seen from her before. Nobody's done that, not since my mother. Silas didn't have a ready answer for that, sat with it a moment instead, letting it settle. I wasn't expecting you either, he said finally. Wasn't expecting anybody. Had gotten fairly comfortable with that particular arrangement actually before you came along and ruined it. I ruined it. Thoroughly. She almost smiled. Are you complaining? No, he said, quiet, certain, more certain than he'd sounded about anything in longer than he cared to count. I am absolutely not complaining. The fire popped low between them. Something in the room had gone very still, very close. The particular stillness that happens right before 2 people either move toward each other or very deliberately don't. Adeline's eyes dropped briefly to his mouth. Came back up. Silas noticed. Couldn't not notice. every nerve in him suddenly, inconveniently alert. He leaned in, slow, giving her every chance in the world to lean away if she wanted to. She didn't lean away, which was when Gus's bedroom door creaked, loud as a gunshot in the quiet house, and both of them jerked back a full foot apart, sudden and guilty, as two children caught at the cookie tin, just as the old man shuffled past the kitchen doorway toward the outhouse, muttering something about too much whiskey and not near enough sensed to know when to stop drinking it. He didn't so much as glance their way. Didn't need to. The particular quality of his not looking said everything his looking might have. The door creaked shut behind him a minute later, and the house went quiet again, and Silas and Adeline sat there in the sudden silence, both of them fighting, with limited success, not to laugh. "Well," Adeline said finally, breathless, cheeks gone pink that had nothing to do with the fire. That was thoroughly interrupted. "Gus has a talent for timing. Does he do that on purpose?" "Every single time," Silas said. "Man's sharper than he lets on, always has been. Should we be embarrassed?" He considered that seriously a moment, watching her, something warm and unhurried settling behind his eyes. "No," he said finally, "I don't think we should be embarrassed at all." Something passed between them, warm and certain, a promise neither one of them rushed to finish out loud, content instead, to let it sit there in the space between them, ready and waiting for, whenever the moment came round again properly. Next time, without an old man's creaking door to interrupt it, the fire popped low between them. Outside, the snow kept its steady, endless watch over the ranch, and neither one of them moved to end the evening for a good while longer, content, for once, to simply sit inside a silence that had stopped being lonely sometime in the last 2 months, without either one fully noticing the exact moment it happened. January brought a hard cold snap that kept them close to the house for the better part of 2 weeks, and it was during that stretch, snowed nearly in, that Silas finally told her the rest of it, the whole of Micah's story. Not just the death but the life. The brother who'd talked him into building a house too big for one man because he'd been certain, absolutely certain, that Silas would eventually need the extra room. He used to say I was stubborn as a fence post, Silas told her, the two of them sitting close by the fire one evening, Gus already asleep in his room down the hall. Said I'd sit alone in an empty house out of pure spite before I'd admit I wanted company. Was he right? Mostly. Silas turned his cup slow in his hands. I spent 4 years proving him right, if I'm honest about it. Told myself the quiet suited me. Told myself I'd chosen it. Had you? No, he admitted. Quiet. Raw. I don't think I had. I think I just didn't know how to want anything different once he was gone. Wanting things felt like tempting fate to take them away again. Adeline was quiet a moment, watching the fire. I understand that, she said finally. More than you'd think. After my mother passed, I caught myself doing the same thing, small things. Wouldn't buy new ribbon for a dress even when I could afford it. Told myself I was being careful with money. Really, I think I was being careful with hoping. Easier not to want a thing at all than to want it and lose it. When did that change for you? She looked at him, something soft and honest in her expression, completely unguarded. About the time a stranger told me to get down and lie flat, and I did it without a single question, she said, and realized somewhere on that mountain road that I trusted a man I'd known 4 hours more than I'd trusted anybody in over a year. Made me wonder what else I'd been keeping myself careful and small about, for no good reason anymore. Silas set his cup down, reached over, slow, deliberate, and covered her hand with his own, the way she'd done for him twice now in that cold barn and this same warm kitchen. I'm glad you climbed into my wagon, he said. Simple. Plain. Everything he meant packed into 6 unremarkable words. I'm glad you didn't turn me in, wasn't ever going to. I know that now, she said. Didn't know it then. Took a considerable leap of faith, climbing under that blanket. Best decision you ever made. We'll see, she said, but she was smiling when she said it, and he was smiling back, and for a long, quiet moment, neither one of them said anything else at all, the fire between them the only sound in the whole snowbound house. By the second week of the cold snap, cabin fever had set in proper. All 3 of them snowed in, tight enough that even Gus's usual chores had shrunk down to almost nothing. And idle hands, it turned out, made for considerably more mischief than Silas had accounted for. It started with the checkers board Gus produced from some forgotten trunk, and escalated by their 3rd straight day of tournament play into something noticeably more competitive than the game strictly called for. "You're cheating," Adeline said, staring hard at the board. "I am not cheating. You moved that piece while I was looking at the fire." "I moved that piece because it was my turn." "It was not your turn," asked Gus. Gus, referee by unanimous and unwilling appointment, held up both hands. "I ain't getting involved in this. Man's got enough troubles without adjudicating a checkers dispute between two people who are very clearly not arguing about checkers." Silas and Adeline both turned to stare at him. "We are absolutely arguing about checkers," Silas said. "Shush, you are," Gus said, entirely unconvinced, and went back to whittling something out of a scrap of pine that was slowly, unmistakably, taking the shape of a small wooden horse. "Carry on. Don't mind me." They carried on. Adeline won, eventually, by a margin narrow enough that both of them claimed victory for the better part of an hour afterward, until Gus finally threatened to confiscate the board fully if the two of them didn't settle it like grown adults, which I am beginning to have serious doubts about. Later, once the board had been put away, and Gus had retired with his half-finished wooden horse, Adeline found Silas standing at the window, watching the snow, something quieter in his posture than the checkers game had left room for. "You're thinking about him again," she said. "Not a question. Micah used to beat me at checkers every single time," Silas said. "Never once let me win. Not even when I was small enough that letting me win would have been the kind thing to do." Said, "A man doesn't learn anything from an easy victory." "Sounds like a hard way to raise a younger brother." It was, Silas agreed. It was also exactly right, most of the time. He looked at her, something warm cutting through the quiet grief. "You'd have liked him. He'd have talked circles around you for an hour, and then admitted, grudging, that you'd out-argued him fair. High praise, from what you've told me of him." "The highest he gave out," Silas said, and reached for her hand, and for a while they simply stood together at the window, watching the snow keep its patient watch over the whole silent valley, comfortable inside a grief that had, somewhere over the past 2 months, stopped being something either one of them carried entirely alone. The trouble started the first week of February, the way trouble usually does, small. At first, easy to dismiss, until it wasn't. Silas noticed it first. A gate left unlatched that he was certain he'd latched himself. A section of fence near the north pasture with fresh boot prints around it that didn't match his own, or Gus's, or Adeline's prints that led up from the tree line and back again. Careful, deliberate, footprint. The mark of somebody who'd wanted to be seen leaving evidence of having been there, without wanting to be seen doing the leaving. He mentioned it to Gus. The old man's face went tight. "Cobb's men," Gus said, "scouting. Making sure we know they know where we are, without doing anything a court could call trespass." "Why now?" "We've been here 2 months. "Because word travels," Gus said grimly. "Even snowed in, word travels. Somebody's talked. Or somebody's guessed. Either way, Vale knows the girl's still here, and Vale's the kind of man who don't like waiting past the point he's decided he's waited long enough." Adeline, listening from the doorway, had gone pale. "If he knows," she said slowly, "he'll know about the letters too, eventually. He'll assume, if nothing else." "Let him assume," Silas said. "Assuming isn't proof. It doesn't need to be proof for him to act," she said. "You know that better than anybody in this house." Nobody argued with that either. It happened 4 nights later. Silas woke to the smell of smoke before he heard anything at all, that particular acrid wrongness that pulls a man up out of sleep faster than any sound could manage, some old animal recognizing danger before the rest of the mind caught up to name it. He was out the door in under a minute. Gus close behind him, both men moving fast through the cold dark toward the orange glow, already lighting up the underside of the low clouds. The hay barn, burning. Not the main barn that would have been a disaster past recovering from, would have meant losing Delilah and the cow and half their winter feed all at once. This was smaller, contained, almost, in a way that felt less like accident and considerably more like message. They got it out with buckets and snow packed hard against the walls, working fast and wordless in the bitter cold, and by the time the last of the smoke had thinned to nothing more than a stubborn haunting smell, the eastern sky had already begun going gray with the first hint of dawn. Silas stood in the wreckage afterward, breathing hard, hands blistered from the bucket handle, and found Pawnawind, half buried in the scorched straw near where the fire had clearly started, a strip of oil-soaked cloth that didn't belong to any tool or lantern he owned. "Set deliberate," Gus said quietly. crouching to look at it himself. No accident starts a fire that contained. Somebody wanted this barn burning and nothing else. A warning, Silas said. Next one might not be so contained. Adeline arrived then, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, face white. With fear, she was visibly working hard to keep out of her voice. I heard the noise, she said. I saw the light. I thought. She stopped herself, swallowed the rest of the sentence, looked at the smoking ruin of the small barn like it was something much more personal than burned straw and scorched timber. This is because of me. This is because of Vale, Silas said, firm, immediate, leaving no room in it for argument. Don't you dare hand him credit for something that's wholly his doing. He wouldn't have burned your barn if I wasn't hiding in it. He wouldn't have needed to burn my barn if he hadn't spent years building a fortune off cheating grieving widows out of their land. Silas shot back, sharper than he meant to, though not one word of it untrue. This isn't your doing, Adeline. This is his. Every last bit of it. She looked at him a long moment, something fragile moving behind her eyes. I should go, she said quietly, before it gets worse. Before he decides the barn isn't warning enough. No. Silas, no. He said again, and stepped closer, close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to hold his gaze. You said something to me back in October. In this same yard, more or less. Said the ranch would run better with two. His voice had gone rough, urgent. Everything he'd been keeping carefully banked for 2 months. Finally, pushing its way up to the surface all at once. It does. It runs better with two. I run better with two. I am not sending you back out into the cold because a coward with a can of oil thinks he can scare you into it. He could hurt you. He could try. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting, Silas said. It was meant to be true. She stared at him, something breaking open behind her eyes, fear and gratitude, and something else considerably warmer than either of those, all tangled together at once. All right, she said finally, quiet, firm. All right, I'm staying. Gus, watching the whole exchange from a few feet away with the exact satisfied patience of a man who'd known exactly how this was going to go before either one of them had figured it out themselves, cleared his throat. Well, he said, now that's settled. Suppose somebody ought to go check whether we've got enough hay left to see the stock through to March, seeing as how a portion of it just went up in smoke. Nobody laughed. Exactly. But something in the tension eased, just slightly, enough to let the three of them turn together, woman, toward the practical business of surviving the rest of that particular morning. It wasn't until later that morning, once the adrenaline had finally drained out of him and left something close to plain exhaustion its place, that Silas noticed his own hand, a burn angry and red, running along the side of his palm where he'd grabbed a section of scorched timber without thinking, too focused on the fire itself to register the pain until well after the danger had passed. Adeline noticed before he'd said a word about it, caught his wrist as he reached for his coffee cup, turned his hand over, palm up, and went very still at what she found there. Silas, it's nothing. It is very clearly not nothing. She was already moving toward the small cabinet where she'd taken to keeping salves and clean cloth, ever since the mare's injured leg had first put the idea of a proper supply in her head. Sit down now, Adeline, sit, he sat. Mostly because arguing with her, he'd learned over the past 4 months, was rarely worth the effort it cost, and never once worth the effort when she'd already made up her mind about something as plainly sensible as tending a burn. She worked in silence for a while, careful and precise, cleaning the wound with a gentleness that seemed, somehow, at odds with the brisk efficiency of everything else about her. Silas watched her face, instead of his own hand the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the particular care she took, winding the clean cloth, like the task in front of her mattered a great deal more than a simple burn strictly warranted. You didn't have to run in after that fire barehanded, she said quietly, not looking up from her work. Didn't think about it. Just moved. That's rather the problem, isn't it? She tied off the bandage, careful, finished, and finally looked up at him, something fierce and frightened, both moving behind her eyes. You didn't think about it. You never think about it. You'll run into a burning barn, face down 3 armed riders, drive a wagon through a blizzard, and never once pause to consider what happens to the rest of us if something happens to you in the middle of all that not thinking. Adeline, I mean it, Silas. Her voice had gone rough, urgent, months of careful composure, finally cracking under the weight of one bad morning. I've buried a mother. I watched a man I trusted turn out to be exactly the kind of monster everyone should have warned me about. I am not. She stopped herself, breath catching, and started again, quieter. I am not equipped to lose anybody else. Not right now. Maybe not ever, so you will forgive me if I insist rather firmly that you think about it next time. He looked at her a long moment, her hand still wrapped careful around his bandaged one, something in his chest going soft and unguarded, in a way 4 years of careful solitude had never once prepared him for. Next time, he said quietly, I'll think about it. Probably, he admitted. But I'll try. That, apparently, was enough. She let out a breath she'd been holding, something between a laugh and a sob, and pressed her forehead briefly against his uninjured shoulder. Just for a moment, just long enough for both of them to feel the whole weight of how close the morning had actually come to going markedly worse than it had. Thank you, she said, muffled, for not arguing about the bandage. At least, I've learned to pick my battles. Wise man. Trying to be, he said, and meant it in every possible way the sentence could be taken. 2 nights before the note appeared, though none of them knew it yet, Gus had woken past midnight to the sound of a horse moving slow along the tree line, not close, not threatening, 3 foot, just present, the peculiar calm pace of a rider who wanted to be near without being caught being near. He'd taken up his shotgun, crept to the window, and watched a single shape sit motionless at the edge of the property the better part of 20 minutes before finally turning and riding off the way he'd come. Young, that much Gus could tell even in the dark, something in the set of the shoulders, the way the rider held himself in the saddle. Not one of the older hands who'd been riding for Vale for years. Somebody newer, somebody who hadn't yet finished deciding what kind of man the job was going to turn him into. He hadn't mentioned it to Silas or Adeline the next morning. Told himself there was nothing to tell a rider. Passing near a property line wasn't a crime, wasn't even particularly unusual out in that country, but he'd sat with an uneasy feeling all that following day, regardless, the particular unease of a man who suspects, without proof, that something is about to happen, and hasn't yet worked out whether it'll be for the better or worse. 2 nights later, he had his answer. The note appeared 2 days later, tucked under a rock near the front gate, discovered by Gus on his way back from checking the fence line. Unsigned. Cramped, uneven handwriting, the writing, clearly, of a man not accustomed to putting his thoughts on paper, working hard to make the letters behave. Silas read it twice at the kitchen table, Adeline and Gus reading over his shoulder, the whole house gone silent around the words. Mr. Rourke, I rode with Vale's men the night your brother died. Wasn't there when it happened, but I heard talk after. Man named Coombs bragged on it once, drunk, said he'd spooked the horse himself on Vale's orders, made it look natural. Coombs is dead now. 3 years back, fever took him. I've carried this a long while and it sat wrong the whole time. Can't sign my name, got family depends on my wages, and Vale don't forgive easy. But I wanted somebody to know it wasn't an accident. Your brother didn't die careless, he died because a man paid for it to look that way. Nobody said anything for a long moment after Silas finished reading it aloud. That's him, Silas said finally, voice tight, strange, caught somewhere between 4 years of grief and something that felt, for the first time, dangerously close to vindication. That's confirmation. Real confirmation, not just Gus's memory of a horse in the dark. It's not signed, Adeline said carefully. It won't hold up in front of a marshal, not on its own. No, Silas agreed, but it's a thread, another piece. He looked at the letter a long moment, something hardening in his expression, resolve settling in where grief had lived alone for 4 long years. We keep pulling them, every thread we can find. Micah's letters, Gus's account, this note, the real rates against the reported ones. We build the whole rope, not just one strand of it, and then we take the entire thing to a federal marshal who can't be bought off the way a county sheriff can. When the pass is open, Gus said. When the pass is open, Silas agreed. Not before. We move too early, too loud, and Vale finds a way to bury every last piece of it before it ever reaches Cheyenne. Adeline looked at the unsigned note a long moment, something fierce and steady moving across her face. He's scared, she said quietly. Whoever wrote this, scared enough to risk his own wages, maybe his own safety, just to make sure somebody knew the truth. She looked up at Silas. There's more people like him. People who've worked for Vale, seen things, said nothing, because saying something cost more than they could afford to pay. If we can find even one more willing to put a name to what they know, we'd have enough, Silas finished. Enough to make it stick. Outside, the wind had picked up again, like snow beginning to swirl thick against the windows, February settling in hard and mean the way it tended to in that part of the territory. But inside the kitchen, something had shifted the fear from 2 nights before. The smoke and the scorched barn, and the unsigned warning tucked under a rock, all of it slowly reforming itself into something considerably more useful. Not just grief anymore, not just fear, a plan. 6 miles east, in a study that smelled of good whiskey and better tobacco, Cormac Vale sat reading a brief report from Ezra Cobb, and did not look pleased. The barn, Vale said, slowly burned, and the girl is still there. Yes, sir. That was meant to encourage a departure, not merely an inconvenience. Rourke's dug in, sir, won't be moved easy. And the old hand Pruitt, he's sharp. Watching the property close now, since the fire. Harder to get anybody near without being seen. Vale set the report down, steepled his fingers, considered the middle distance with the distinctive cold patience that had built him an empire out of other people's misfortune. They're building something, he said, not a question. Digging into old papers, asking questions. That's the only reason a man holds his ground this hard against a burned barn and a plain enough warning. Could be, sir. It is, Vale said, certain. Rourke's brother left something behind. Something incomplete, perhaps, 4 years ago. And now the girls brought him a reason to finish it. He was quiet a long moment, turning the problem over the way. He turned over every problem unhurried, methodical, entirely without the particular heat that made lesser men careless. We wait for the thaw, he said finally. Same as I told you before. But when the pass is open, Cobb, I want to know exactly what they intend to carry out of that ranch, and exactly who they intend to carry it to. And I want it handled before it ever reaches a desk in Cheyenne. His eyes had gone flat, cold altogether, without mercy. Mr. Rourke has apparently inherited his brother's stubbornness along with his brother's house. That is unfortunate for him. Stubbornness, in my experience, tends to get a man exactly what his more sensible relatives already received. Cobb didn't answer that. Didn't need to. Simply nodded, once, and started to leave, then stopped, hand on the door, something clearly still weighing on him. There's one more thing, sir. Vale didn't look up from his whiskey. Go on. Young Wexford rode with us last fall out to the Rourke place, the day we lost the girl's trail. Cobb chose his words with visible care now. He's been quiet the past week or two, quieter than usual. Missed his shift Tuesday, said he'd taken ill, and this morning I noticed his good boots gone from the bunkhouse, along with a fair bit of his wages he'd been saving. Now Vale did look up. You think he's run? I think, Cobb said carefully. A young man with a conscience he hasn't yet learned to bury properly sometimes does foolish things when that conscience gets the better of him. Whether he's run for good or just gone quiet a spell, I couldn't say for certain. Vale set his glass down, slow, deliberate, forbearant, the specific stillness of a man recalculating a problem he'd believed, until 30 seconds ago, to be far smaller than it apparently was. Find him, he said quietly. I have no interest in making a public matter of one nervous boy's crisis of conscience, but I would very much like to know precisely what, if anything, he said, and to whom, before this goes any further than it already may have. Yes, sir. And Cobb. Vale's voice had gone soft now, softer than before, which was, as Cobb had learned over 9 long years, always the more dangerous register. You rode with Micah Rourke's brother's men that night, 4 years back. You know precisely what happens to sleuths if they're left dangling too long. Something flickered behind Cobb's eyes, old, unpleasant, the same buried thing that had surfaced briefly back in October, watching smoke rise over a dead man's chimney. I remember, Cobb said quietly. Good, Vale said. See that Wexford remembers it, too, wherever he's gotten himself to, assuming he's still in a position to be reminded. Cobb left the study without another word, and Vale sat alone a while longer, turning the whiskey slow in its glass, considering the particular inconvenience of young men who hadn't yet learned that conscience, in his experience, was a luxury the poor could rarely afford to indulge in, and the rich had long since learned to live entirely without. Outside the window, the February snow kept falling over the whole of the valley over the Vale estate, and the ranch 6 miles west, and the mountain passes that would, eventually, thaw and open and decide, one way or another, whose version of the truth would finally reach the outside world first. He came in on the coldest night of that February, 3 days after Vale gave the order to find him, half frozen and stumbling, his horse blown out beneath him from what had clearly been a hard, desperate ride. Gus heard him first, the shotgun already in hand before he'd fully registered what he was hearing. Some rider approaching the house directly, instead of skulking at the tree line the way Cobb's scouts had taken to doing. Rourke. The voice from outside was young, ragged, exhausted, past the point of caution. Mr. Rourke, please. I mean no harm. I'm the one who left the note. Silas was at the door before Gus had finished deciding whether to shoot first and ask questions after. Found a young man collapsed nearly to his knees in the yard. No more than 20, maybe younger, coats soaked through, hands shaking too hard from cold or fear or both to be steady. Wexford, Silas said. Not a question. Somehow already he knew. The young man looked up, startled that his name was known. You got the note then? We got it. I wasn't going to come here. Wasn't going to say anything more than what I already wrote. But Vale's men are looking for me. Cobb came by the bunkhouse 2 nights back, asking questions, and I could see in his face he already half suspected. Wexford's voice cracked, exhaustion and fear, both finally breaking through the careful composure he'd clearly been holding on to for days. I didn't know where else to go. Didn't have anybody else who'd believe a word I said against a man like Vale. Adeline appeared in the doorway behind Silas, took one look at the shivering, half-frozen young man in the yard, and moved past both men without hesitation. Get him inside, she said. Now he'll lose fingers to the cold if we stand here debating it. They got him inside. Got him by the fire, wrapped in blankets, a hot cup pressed into his shaking hands, and it took the better part of 20 minutes before he'd steadied enough to speak clearly. I never wanted any part of what happened to your brother, he said finally, looking at Silas with the raw honesty of a young man who has run out of any reason left to lie. I was new that year. Didn't understand yet what kind of work I'd signed on for. By the time I did understand it, I was already in deep enough that walking away felt like it had cost me everything, my wages, maybe worse. He looked down at the cup in his hands. Coombs used to brag when he'd been drinking, told the story more than once, like it was something to be proud of. Said spooking a horse on a mountain trail was the easiest work he'd ever been paid for. Who gave the order? Silas asked. Quiet, steady. Everything in him focused down to that single question. Vale, Wexford said. Direct. Coombs was clear on that part every time he told it. Vale wanted your brother stopped before he could take whatever he was building to somebody who'd listen. Coombs made sure he never got the chance. The kitchen had gone utterly silent, the only sound the fire and the wind outside, and Wexford's own ragged breathing slowly evening out under the blankets. Will you say that to a marshal? Silas said. In Cheyenne. When the pass is open, will you put your name to it? Wexford was quiet a long moment, visibly wrestling with the full weight of what was being asked of him. I've got nothing left to lose now, he said finally. Vale already knows I've turned. Man like that doesn't forgive a thing like this, whether I sign my name or not. He looked up, something steadier settling into his young face. Might as well make it count for something, if I'm going to lose everything over it regardless. You'll stay here, Silas said. Till the pass is open. You'll be safe here. You don't owe me safety. Not after what I was part of, even secondhand. I'm not offering it because I owe you, Silas said. I'm offering it because my brother spent his last weeks trying to stop exactly the kind of thing you just confirmed happened to him. Seems like the least I can do is make sure the one man willing to say so out loud doesn't end up the same way. Wexford didn't have an answer for that. Just nodded, throat working, and looked back down at the cup, warming slowly in his shaking hands. Gus, watching from near the stove, met Silas's eyes over the young man's bowed head. Something grim and satisfied both settled into the old man's weathered face. Well, Gus said quietly, reckon that's the whole rope now. Every strand of it, finally all in one place. Almost, Silas said, looking at the 4 of them gathered in the small warm kitchen himself, Adeline, Gus, and a frightened young man who'd risked everything to finally tell the truth. We still need the passes to open. Still need to get all of this to Cheyenne before Vale finds a way to bury it, or bury us. Then we wait, Adeline said, steady, certain, and, in the meantime, we keep this young man fed, and warm, and hidden, same as you did for me. Silas looked at her a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind his eyes. Seems to be a habit of mine now. he said, taking in strangers who show up half frozen with the truth in their hands. A good habit, Adeline said, one of your better ones. Outside, the wind howled on against the windows, and inside, the fire burned steady, and 4 people who 4 months ago had been strangers to one another sat together in the warm kitchen light, bound now by something far stronger than circumstance, bound by a truth none of them intended to let Cormac Vale bury a second time. Wexford settled into the rhythm of the ranch faster than any of them expected. The particular fast settling of a young man who has spent months carrying a guilty conscience and finally, blessedly, has somewhere useful to put the nervous energy of it. He took to the chores with something close to gratitude, mucking the stalls, hauling water, mending what needed mending, working alongside Gus most days while Silas and Adeline kept at the paperwork in Micah's office. The old man had taken to the boy quick in his own gruff way, the way Gus tended to take to anybody willing to listen to his stories without complaint. "You ever roped anything in your life, boy?" Gus asked him, the second week, watching Wexford make a genuinely dreadful attempt at coiling a lasso. "Grew up in Cheyenne proper. Never had cause to." "Well, that explains a great deal." Gus took the rope from him, demonstrated the coil with the easy competence of 60 years practice. Man can't call himself a ranch hand, even a temporary one, without knowing his way round a rope. "Watch close. I'm only showing you the once." Wexford watched close, tried again, made a marginally less dreadful attempt the second time, and something like genuine pride crossed his young face at the small improvement. "Better," Gus allowed. "Still terrible, but better. High praise. Only kind I hand out." They worked in companionable quiet a while after that, and it was Wexford, unprompted, who finally broke it. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Pruitt?" "You can ask. Don't guarantee I'll answer, but you can ask. Do you think a man can undo a thing like this? What I was part of, even secondhand, even just by staying quiet about it so long." The young man's hands had gone still on the rope, something raw working across his face. "Or is a man just stuck carrying it, regardless what he does after?" Gus considered the question a long moment, serious now, all the gruff humor set aside. "I carried a thing like that myself," he said finally. 4 years. Saw something the night your Coombs did his dirty work, and said nothing about it, out of plain fear, and told myself the silence didn't cost anything, because nobody'd asked me the right question yet to make me answer honestly." He looked at Wexford steady. "Don't think a man ever fully undoes a thing like that, but I think he can put it down. Eventually, once he's finally done carrying it alone, and done something honest about it instead. Is that what telling Silas did for you? Put it down?" "Some of it," Gus admitted. "Rest of it, I expect, gets put down properly the day we finally stand in front of that marshal and say the whole truth out loud, in the daylight, look, where it can't be denied or buried a second time." He handed the rope back to Wexford, nodded toward the coil. "Try it again, and quit thinking so hard about your soul while you do it. Man can't coil a rope proper if he's busy interrogating his own conscience at the same time." Wexford tried again. This time the coil held. In the evenings, after the chores were done and the paperwork set aside, the 5 of them, for it was 5 now, in every way that mattered, whether or not the arrangement had a proper name, yet settled into something that almost, dangerously, resembled ordinary family life. Adeline taught Wexford to play checkers. Since Gus had grown tired of losing to her and declared himself retired from the sport for the season, Wexford proved a quick study, sharp enough that within a week he was giving Adeline genuine trouble, and the 2 of them fell into an easy, teasing rapport that reminded Silas, watching from across the room some evenings, of that distinct way younger siblings settle into each other's company, quick to argue, quicker to laugh, entirely comfortable in a way that had nothing forced about it. "You're better at this than you let on," Adeline told him one evening, studying the board with newfound wariness. "I had a great deal of time to think, riding out here half frozen," Wexford said. "Man's mind works strange things out under that kind of pressure. Apparently it works out checkers strategy along with everything else." "Apparently." Silas watched them, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest, the particular warmth of a house that had, somewhere over the past 4 months, filled itself back up with the specific kind of noise and company it had been built for and had gone 4 long years without. He thought of Micah's old words, the ones about a house needing room to grow into, thought that his brother, wherever he was, would likely have found the current arrangement one runaway bride, one repentant conscience, one stubborn old ranch hand, and one grieving rancher slowly learning how to want things again, a good deal more amusing than tragic, and would have approved of every last bit of it. "You're smiling," Adeline said, catching him, not looking up from the checkers board. "MUR. It's a good look on you. You should do it more often." "I've been told," Silas said, and found Pawnawind, for once, admits that he didn't have any particular argument ready against the idea. Cobb came looking 3 days later. Silas saw him first, a lone rider picking his way up the ranch road at a deliberate, unhurried pace that told its own story before the man had said a single word. Not a search party this time, just Cobb, alone, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than a dozen riders would have been. "Get Wexford in the loft," Silas said quietly to Gus, already moving toward the door. "Stay there till I say otherwise." Gus didn't argue. Hustled the young man out the back, quick and quiet, while Silas stepped out onto the porch to meet Cobb in the yard, alone, the way he'd learned over the past 4 months that these particular conversations went better without an audience. Cobb. Rourke. The lean rider sat his horse a moment, studying the house, the yard, the barn still scarred black along one wall from the fire 3 weeks back. "Lost a man, wondering if he's come through this way." "Haven't seen him." Cobb's eyes narrowed, slightly careful. That's so." A long silence stretched between them, cold and watchful, neither man moving, the horse shifting restless beneath Cobb in the quiet. "You know," Cobb said finally, conversational, almost gentle, "I rode with your brother's men once. Years back, before any of this, before Vale." Something shifted behind his weathered face, old and complicated. "Micah Rourke did me a kindness once. Small thing. Loaned me traveling money when I was stranded in Cheyenne with an empty pocket and a long way home. Never once asked to be paid back." Silas went very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Don't rightly know," Cobb admitted, something raw working underneath his careful composure. "Maybe because I've spent 4 years telling myself a man does what he's paid to do and doesn't ask further questions about it. Maybe because that's gotten harder to believe lately the longer I sit a horse for Cormac Vale." He looked at Silas a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You tell that boy, if you do happen to see him, that not every man riding for Vale sleeps easy at night about it. Some of us are just waiting on the right moment to stop." He turned his horse before Silas could find an answer for that, started back down the ranch road at the same measured pace he'd arrived at, and called back once over his shoulder, not quite looking back. "Passes'll open soon enough, Rourke. Whatever you're building out here, you'd best have it ready when they do." Then he was gone, back down the snow-packed road toward Larkspur Hollow, and Silas stood a long while in the cold yard, turning the strange, unsettling conversation over in his mind, wondering whether he'd just been threatened, or warned, or something considerably more complicated than either. He didn't tell Wexford about the visit until that evening, and even then, Yup softened it some, though the young man's face had gone pale regardless. "He'll be back," Wexford said quietly. "Cobb doesn't ride off that easy unless he's already decided something." "Maybe," Silas said, "or maybe he's deciding something else fully." Man didn't sound like somebody entirely comfortable in his own skin today. Adeline, listening from across the kitchen, looked between the two men, something thoughtful moving behind her eyes. "There's more of them like that," she said slowly. "Isn't there? Men who ride for Vale because the wages are steady, not because their conscience is settled about it." "Maybe," Silas said again. "Doesn't change what we need to do. Doesn't change the passes, or the marshal, or getting every piece of this in front of somebody who can't be bought off." "No," Adeline agreed. "But it might change how this ends once we get there. Might mean not every man standing behind Vale intends to keep standing there once the truth's finally out in the open." Nobody had an answer for that yet, but the thought sat with all of them, the rest of that evening, quiet and considering, one more small thread woven into the larger rope they'd spent the whole winter building. The question of exactly how to reach Cheyenne occupied a good portion of the following weeks, argued out in careful pieces as over supper, over the checkers board, over the cluttered desk in Micah's old office. "We can't simply ride into town and post it," Silas said. One such evening, the whole household gathered around the kitchen table, with the growing collection of documents spread between them. "Vale's got eyes on every road out of Larkspur Hollow. Anything mailed from that post office, he'll know about within the hour. There's the county seat at Bridger's Crossing, Gus offered. 2 days' ride east in decent weather. Smaller place. Vale's reach doesn't stretch quite so far in that direction, near as I know. Far as you know, Adeline repeated, skeptical. That's not much of a guarantee. It's the best guarantee available to us, Gus said, unless somebody's got a better notion. Wexford, quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. There's a man in Bridger's Crossing, runs the telegraph office. Name of Whitlock. I delivered messages there twice, back before I understood what kind of errands I was actually running for Vale. He hesitated, then pressed on. He wasn't friendly to Vale's business. Made that plain enough, both times, without ever quite saying so outright. Might be a place to start, if somebody needed to get word to Cheyenne fast, without going through channels Vale's got his hooks into. Could you find him again? This Whitlock? I could. Silas considered this new information carefully, turning it over the way he turned over everything, weighing risk against necessity. Once the pass is open, he said finally, we don't wait around for the roads to be comfortable. We move fast, straight to Bridger's Crossing, and we get everything we've got into federal hands before Vale's had more than a day or two to react. And if he reacts faster than that, Adeline asked, if he's got somebody watching the moment those passes clear, then we'll have made his choice for him, Silas said grimly. Man spent 4 years being patient because patience served him. Once we're moving, once the truth's actually in motion toward Cheyenne, patience stops serving him at all. That's when a man like Vale gets dangerous, not before. The table went quiet at that, the weight of it settling over all 4 of them, the understanding that whatever careful, hidden work they'd done all winter was building toward a moment noticeably more exposed, considerably more dangerous than anything the snowbound months had asked of them yet. Then we prepare for it, Gus said finally, breaking the silence with the exact gruff practicality that had steadied all of them more than once that winter. We don't wait for spring to start planning what spring's going to require of us. We plan now. We ready horses, ready supplies, ready every piece of paper so it's traveling safe and dry no matter what weather the road throws at us. He looked around the table at each of them in turn. Man doesn't survive a hard winter by hoping the thaw goes easy. He survives it by being ready the moment it doesn't. Nobody argued with that either. Back at the ranch, the days settled into a new rhythm, chores done more carefully now, eyes on the tree line more often than not, Gus taking to sleeping with a shotgun propped within easy reach and not apologizing to anybody for the precaution. But underneath the wariness, something else kept growing too, steady and undeterred by any amount of smoke or unsigned warnings. Proof of it arrived the second week of March, in the form of a small basket left at the front gate sometime in the night, discovered by Gus on his morning rounds. Fresh bread, a jar of preserves, a few strips of dried venison, and no note at all, nothing to say who'd left it or why, or how they'd made it out to the ranch and back, without a single one of them hearing hoofbeats in the night. Widow Halloran. I'd wager, Silas said, turning the basket over, looking for any hint of who might have sent it. She's got a soft spot for strays. Told me so herself back in October, though I didn't understand at the time she meant it as fair warning. Or Reverend Hale, Gus offered. Man's never had much love for Vale's particular brand of Christian charity. Wouldn't put it past him to send something quiet, without wanting credit for it. Could be either, Adeline said, examining the preserves with something soft moving across her face. Could be somebody else entirely. Somebody we haven't even considered. Does it matter which? Wexford asked. No, Silas said slowly, understanding settling over him in a way that eased something tight in his chest that had been sitting there since the barn fire. I don't suppose it does. Only matters that somebody in that town still remembers which side decency sits on, even with Vale's money sitting heavy over half the county. More baskets came, over the following weeks, never signed, never explained, arriving at odd hours by hands nobody ever quite managed to catch sight of. A sack of oats, a length of good rope. Once, memorably, a jar of hard candy that Gus claimed, with a completely straight face, was obviously intended for him personally and nobody else. It's for all of us, Gus. Prove it. Nobody could prove it, and Gus ate the better part of the jar himself over the following week, entirely unrepentant about the theft. But underneath the small, gentle joke of it, all 4 of them understood what the baskets actually meant, that Larkspur Hollow, whatever its fear of Cormac Vale's money and Cormac Vale's reach, hadn't altogether surrendered its own conscience to either one. That somewhere in that frightened, careful town, people were watching it and remembering it and quietly choosing which side of the coming reckoning they intended to stand on, long before the passes opened wide enough to make that choice a public one. "It's not much," Adeline said one evening, looking at the latest basket sitting on the kitchen table. "A basket of bread isn't proof, isn't testimony. Won't mean anything to a marshal in Cheyenne." "No," Silas agreed. "But it means something here. Means we're not as alone in this, as Vale spent 4 years counting on us being." He looked at the small, humble collection of goods, and something steady and warm settled behind his eyes. Man built his whole fortune on the assumption that fear would keep folks quiet forever. Might be he's finally wrong about that. Silas found Adeline in Micah's old office one evening in the last week of February, well past when either of them should have been asleep, poring over the third of Micah's letters by lamplight, her hair coming loose from its pins the same way. It had been the very first time he'd seen her, hiding in the back of his wagon with a small bag and a whole world of trouble clutched in both hands. "You should sleep," he said from the doorway. "So should you. I'm the one telling you to sleep. That gives me the moral advantage." "It gives you nothing of the sort," she said, not looking up from the page. "You're standing in the doorway instead of your own bed," which rather undercuts the argument. He came in anyway, sat across from her at the cluttered desk, and for a while neither one of them said much, the lamp burning low between them, snow ticking soft against the window glass. "We're going to win this," she said eventually. Quiet, more to herself than to him, though she meant it for him too. "Aren't we?" "I don't know," Silas said honestly. "I know we're going to try everything in our power to. I know that's more than my brother had a chance to do himself. That has to count for something." "It does," he said. "It counts for a great deal, actually." She looked up at him, then, lamplight warm across her face. 4 months of shared cold and shared grief and shared careful, growing trust settled comfortably into the space between them. "I'm glad I climbed into your wagon," she said, echoing his own words back to him from weeks before. "Best decision either one of us ever made," he said, and reached across the cluttered desk and took her hand. They sat like that a long while, the lamp burning low, the wind moving soft outside the window, and Silas found himself, not for the first time that winter, taking careful stock of everything the past 4 months had handed him. A stranger becomes something much more than a stranger, an old friend's courage finally spoken aloud after 4 long years of silence, a frightened young man's conscience risks everything to set a wrong right, and underneath all of it, steady and patient as the snow itself, the slow, unstoppable gathering of a truth that Cormac Vale had spent 4 years believing safely buried. It wasn't buried, not anymore. It had simply been waiting, the way truth sometimes does, for the right hands to finally dig it back up. "The passes will open in April," Adeline said quietly, echoing the thought sitting in both their minds. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. 6 weeks, Silas agreed. Then Cheyenne. Then a marshal who answers to Washington instead of Cormac Vale's money. And after that, he considered the question a long moment, turning it over the way he turned over most things, slow, careful, unhurried. Even now, even with everything they'd built finally within reach of the daylight it deserved. After that, he said, we find out what kind of life gets built on the other side of a truth like this one. Together, if you're still willing. "I'm still willing," Adeline said, steady, certain, no hesitation in it at all. "I climbed into the back of a stranger's wagon in October with absolutely nothing but a small bag and a great deal of hope. Seems only fitting I ride out the rest of this winter the same way with considerably more than I started with, and no intention whatsoever of turning back now." Outside, the February snow kept falling over the whole quiet valley, patient as it had always been, indifferent to plans and passes, and the particular stubborn hope of 2 people who had decided, against every reasonable caution, to keep building something together anyway. The passes would open in April. Whatever was coming, whatever Vale intended, whatever the marshal in Cheyenne would eventually make of a dead lawyer's letters, an old man's 4-year-old memory, a torn survey page kept hidden 4 long years in a barn loft, and one young rider's hard-won courage to finally put his name to the truth, none of it had arrived yet. For now, there was only the fire and the lamplight, and the quiet, and 4 people under one roof. Still here, still together, mood, still determined. Whatever the last weeks of winter in Cormac Vale's cold, deliberate patience still had left to throw at them, before the thaw finally came and carried all of them, one way or another, down out of these mountains and into whatever waited for them on the other side. The thaw came the second week of April, the way thaws always came in that country, not gradual, not gentle, but sudden, almost violent. Snowmelt roaring down every gully and creek bed at once, like the whole mountain had been holding its breath all winter, and finally, all at once, let it out. And Silas stood at the top of the ridge trail the morning the pass cleared, looking down at mud where there'd been ice for 5 straight months, and felt something in his chest clear along with it, because it was time, because waiting was finished, because every careful, hidden thing they'd built all winter, Micah's letters, Gus's account, the torn survey page, Wexford's confession, had been sitting coiled and ready since February, and now finally there was a road to carry it down. He rode back to the house at a hard pace, found Adeline already at the door watching him come, like she'd known before he said a word. "It's open," "I know," she said. "I could hear the creak from the porch this morning. Hasn't run that loud since October." They looked at each other a long moment. 5 months of winter compressed into that one look. The wagon, the letter Kawakek, the barn fire, the checkers games, the near kiss Gus's door had interrupted, and neither one of them had ever quite finished out loud. "We go tomorrow," Silas said. "First light. Straight for Bridger's Crossing." "Tomorrow," Adeline agreed, and something fierce and ready settled behind her eyes. The same look she'd worn the day she'd climbed into the back of his wagon, with nothing but a small bag and more courage than sense. That evening the whole household gathered in Micah's old office one final time, laying out every piece of evidence across the cluttered desk for one last careful review before it left the safety of the house that had sheltered it all winter. Silas held his brother's letters a long moment before folding them back into his coat, running his thumb once over the familiar, slanted handwriting, the peculiar weight of finally carrying a dead man's unfinished work the last mile of its long journey. "Feels strange," he admitted quietly, "letting these out of the house at all. Been sitting in that desk drawer since October. Feels like sending part of him out into the world again." "He'd want that," Adeline said, watching him with something gentle and understanding. "Wouldn't he? Wanted this exact thing 4 years ago. Wanted the truth moving, not sitting still." "He would," Silas agreed. "Doesn't make it feel any less strange letting it go." Gus, checking the saddlebags one final time by lamplight, looked up at that. "Nothing wrong with strange," he said. "Most things worth doing feel strange right up until the moment they're finally done. Man gets used to carrying a weight, starts to forget the weight was ever meant to be set down somewhere. Eventually, he tied off the last strap, satisfied. "Tomorrow we set it down, right where it belongs." Wexford, quiet through most of the evening, spoke up from where he sat rereading his own written account one final time, checking every word against his memory, making certain nothing in it wavered. "What happens to me?" he asked, not quite looking up. "Once this is over, assuming it goes the way we're hoping." The room went quiet a moment. "Whatever you want to happen," Silas said finally. "You've got a place here, long as you need one. Ranch could use another set of hands, honestly. Once the pass is clear proper and the real spring work starts." He considered the young man a moment longer. "But you're not obligated to any of it. You did what you did because it was right, not because it bought you a permanent claim on anybody's charity." Wexford looked up at that, something moving behind his young eyes that hadn't fully settled there since he'd first arrived at the ranch half-frozen in February. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like to stay, if that's truly on offer." "It's on offer," Adeline said, warm, certain. "Has been since the night you rode in nearly frozen through. We don't extend kindness with conditions attached in this house." "No," Wexford agreed, something like the beginning of real belonging settling into his voice. "I've noticed that it's taken some getting used to." They finished the evening's preparations in comfortable quiet. After that, 4 people, readying themselves for whatever the following days would ask of them, and Silas found himself lying awake that night beside Adeline, thinking not of danger, not of Vale, but of the particular strange gratitude of a house that had spent 4 empty years waiting for exactly this kind of full, purposeful evening, and had finally, at long last, gotten one. They left before dawn. 4 riders: Silas, Adeline, Gus, and Wexford, each one carrying a portion of the winter's evidence, divided carefully between saddlebags. Because Gus had insisted, grim and practical, that no single bag should hold the whole of it. Man drops a bag crossing a creek, Gus said, or a bag gets stolen off a saddle in the night, and if it's everything in one place, we've lost the whole case in a single unlucky moment. Spread it out. Give the truth more than one way to survive the trip. Nobody argued with that logic. Silas carried Micah's letters, close against his chest inside his coat. Adeline carried the ledger of true rates against reported ones. Gus carried the torn survey page, wrapped still in its oilcloth. Wexford carried a written account of his own, painstakingly composed over 3 long evenings, signed with his own hand, because he'd insisted on that too, that the words be his, not dictated, not softened, whatever they cost him. The ride to Bridger's Crossing was 2 days in good weather. The weather was not good. Mud slowed them the first day. The trail churned soft and treacherous by the thaw, horses laboring hock-deep through stretches that should have been solid ground a month before. They made camp that first night cold and exhausted, Wexford's hands shaking as he tried to get a fire started until Gus took over with the distinctive gruff patience he'd shown the boy all winter. "You'll get the knack of it," Gus said. "Same as the rope. Everything out here takes a knack, apparently. Everything out here'll kill you if you don't learn the knack quick enough," Gus said, not unkindly. "Best get learning." They ate cold rations, huddled close to the small fire, and Silas found himself watching Adeline across the flames the way he had that first night in the line cabin, except this time there was no uncertainty in it, no stranger's caution, just 5 months of accumulated trust settled comfortable between them. "Second thoughts?" he asked her. "Had turned in." "None," she said. You? "None," he said, "just wondering what my brother would make of all this, watching us finally finish what he started." "I think," Adeline said slowly, "he'd be proud. And I think he'd tell you it took you long enough." Silas almost laughed. "That does sound like him. High praise, from what you've told me." "The highest," he agreed, and reached across the small fire and took her hand, and for a while, neither one of them said anything else at all. The trouble found them the second morning, not far past the fork where the trail split toward Bridger's Crossing. 2 riders, sitting their horses square across the narrow trail, unmistakably waiting rather than passing through. Silas recognized one of them immediately, a broad, sullen man who'd ridden with Cobb's crew the previous October, the one who'd looked hardest at Adeline's ruined shoes outside the mercantile. "Well," the broad rider said, easy, almost friendly, though nothing about his posture matched the tone. "Didn't expect to run into Rourke and his whole traveling circus way out here." "We've got no business with you," Silas said, keeping his voice level, already calculating the ground between the 4 of them and the tree line, the angle a man would need to cut wide around 2 riders blocking a narrow trail. "Might be you don't," the rider said. "Might be Mr. Vale's got different feelings about that." Gus's hand had drifted slow and unhurried toward the rifle flap across his saddle. Wexford had gone very pale beside him, but hadn't flinched, hadn't reached for anything, and just held his ground with the particular stiff courage of a young man determined not to be the one who broke first. "You'd be smart," Silas said, "to think hard about what you're actually being asked to do here. Held up 4 people on an open trail, in daylight, with a federal marshal, expecting us in Bridger's Crossing inside the hour. That's not a job. That's a rope, if it goes wrong." Something flickered across the rider's face, the first crack of real uncertainty. The specific hesitation of a hired man doing quick, unpleasant math about exactly how much his wages were actually worth. The second rider, younger, said nothing at all, watching the whole exchange with visible unease. "We're not looking for trouble," Adeline said, steady, unafraid, meeting the broad rider's eyes directly. "We're looking for the truth to finally reach somebody who can do something about it. You can stand in that road and be part of stopping it, or you can step aside and let it pass, and go back to whatever life you're building for yourself that doesn't have to include this particular morning in it." The broad rider studied her a long moment, studied Silas, studied the tight, unified line the 4 of them made, none of them backing down, none of them looking anywhere close to bluffing. "Vale don't pay me enough for this," he said finally, disgusted, more with himself than with them. He turned his horse aside, cleared the trail. "Go on then. I never saw you." They rode past without another word, Tension coiled tight in every muscle until the two riders had faded well behind them, and it wasn't until the trail widened again, safe ground opening up on either side, that Silas let himself breathe fully. "That was close," Wexford said, voice still unsteady. "Closer than I'd like," Silas agreed. "But it held. That's what matters." "You weren't afraid," Adeline said, looking at him with something fierce and admiring in her expression. "I was terrified," Silas admitted. "Just didn't have the luxury of showing it." She almost laughed, the tension finally breaking loose in all of them at once, and they rode the rest of the way to Bridger's Crossing, markedly lighter than they'd started that particular morning. Four people who had just discovered, in the space of a few tense minutes on an open trail, exactly how solid the ground beneath their unlikely alliance had actually become. They reached Bridger's Crossing on the second afternoon, tired and mud-streaked, and found the telegraph office easy enough, a small clapboard building at the edge of town. A lean, sharp-eyed man behind the counter who looked up sharp when Wexford walked through the door. "Whitlock," Wexford said. "Don't know if you remember me." The telegraph operator studied him a long moment, recognition slowly dawning. "Vale's boy. The quiet one. You look considerably worse for wear than the last time you came through here." "Long winter," Wexford said. "I'm not his boy anymore. Haven't been since February." Something shifted in Whitlock's expression, careful, assessing, and then, slowly, approving. "That's so." He looked past Wexford at the rest of them, at the saddlebags, at the particular grim determination on all four faces. "You'd best tell me what you need then, and quick. Word travels fast in a town this size, and I'd wager Vale's got at least one set of eyes somewhere in Bridger's Crossing, same as everywhere else." Silas stepped forward. "We need a federal marshal. Today, if one can be reached. We've got evidence of murder and fraud against Cormac Vale, 4 years in the building, and we need it in front of somebody who can't be bought off before he finds a way to bury it." Whitlock didn't hesitate. "Marshal Dunmore's stationed out of Cheyenne. Wire takes an hour, maybe less, if the lines are running clear after the thaw." He was already moving toward his equipment, businesslike, calm in the specific way of a man who'd been waiting a long while for exactly this kind of request. "You've got a place to hole up while you wait for a reply?" "We'll find one. Find one quiet," Whitlock said, "and don't advertise your business around town till the marshal's actually standing in front of you. Cormac Vale's got a long reach and a longer memory, and I'd hate to see 4 people who rode 2 hard days through mud get themselves undone in the last mile for want of caution." The wire came back within the hour, same as Whitlock had promised. Marshal Otis Dunmore was 3 days out on other business, but would divert to Bridger's Crossing immediately. Upon receiving word, a message relayed back through Whitlock's careful, deliberate hand, each word chosen to convey urgency without alarm to anybody who might be watching the wires. 3 days. 3 days to sit in a small rented room above the Mercantile, evidence spread carefully across a borrowed table, going over every piece of it again and again, checking dates against dates, names against names, making certain the whole rope held together without a single weak strand anywhere along its length. 3 days was also, as it turned out, exactly enough time for word to reach Cormac Vale. They didn't know it yet, sitting in that small rented room. Didn't know that Ezra Cobb, riding a routine patrol near the county line, had spotted 4 familiar horses tied outside the Bridger's Crossing telegraph office on the very first evening, and had sat his own horse in a shadowed alley a long while, turning over the same old complicated calculation that had been eating at him all winter. Didn't know that Cobb had ridden back toward the Vale estate that night, with the information burning in his chest like something he couldn't decide whether to spend or bury. Didn't know that Cobb had stood outside Vale's study for the better part of 20 minutes before finally, slowly, deciding. "There in Bridger's Crossing," Cobb told him. Flat. Final. Rourke, the girl, the old hand, and young Wexford. Sitting on something, from the look of it. Wired for a federal marshal, if the operator's as loose-lipped as I've always suspected him to be. Vale set down his glass very slowly, very deliberately. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Something moved behind Vale's cold, careful eyes, the first real crack Cobb had seen in 9 years of riding for the man, the flicker of somebody realizing, all at once, that patience had finally run out of road. "How long?" Vale said. "Until the marshal arrives." "Wire didn't say exact. My guess. 2 days. Maybe 3. Vale was quiet a long moment, calculating the whole cold machinery of him working through possibilities with the same unhurried precision that had built his entire fortune. Then we have a narrow window, he said finally. Narrow but sufficient. He looked at Cobb, something flat and merciless settling into his expression. Ride to Bridger's Crossing tonight. Take 4 men. I want whatever they're carrying intercepted before that marshal ever lays eyes on it. Cobb didn't move. Cobb, no, Cobb said quietly. Vale went very still. I beg your pardon. No, sir, Cobb said, steadier now. Something 4 years buried, finally working its way to the surface. I rode with Micah Rourke's men once, years back. Man did me a kindness I never repaid. I've spent 4 years telling myself that riding for you didn't cost me anything I couldn't live with. His voice had gone rough, raw, everything he'd been carrying finally spilling loose all at once. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong a long while now, and I'm not riding against that family a second time. Not for you. Not for anybody. Vale studied him a long moment, cold, assessing the particular flat calculation of a man, deciding exactly how dangerous this new inconvenience had suddenly become. You understand, he said quietly, what refusing me costs a man. I understand, Cobb said. Reckon I've understood it a long while, and just been too much a coward to act on it properly till now. He turned and walked out of the study without waiting to be dismissed, and Cormac Vale sat alone in the sudden silence, whiskey forgotten in his hand, the first genuine uncertainty he'd felt in 20 years of careful, patient cruelty finally settling cold into his chest. He would need other men, would find them. Easily enough money bought loyalty even when conscience refused it. But something in Cobb's quiet, firm refusal had rattled him more than he cared to examine too closely, and Cormac Vale, for the first time, in longer than he could remember, found himself moving not from patience now, but from something far closer to fear. Marshal Otis Dunmore arrived at Bridger's Crossing on the morning of the second day, a full day earlier than expected, having ridden through the night. Once Whitlock's second, more urgent wire had reached him. He was a broad, easy man of perhaps 50, with that distinct calm authority of somebody who had spent 30 years watching frightened people try to convince him of things and had developed, over that time, an unshakable instinct for the difference between panic and truth. He listened to all 4 of them in turn, in the small rented room above the mercantile, going through every piece of evidence with careful, methodical attention. Micah's letters, the ledger of true rates against reported ones, the torn survey page, Wexford's written confession, Gus's account of the night riders on the North Trail. When they'd finished, he sat quiet a long moment, turning it all over. This is considerable, he said finally, more considerable than most cases that cross my desk. He looked at Silas directly. You understand what happens next. I ride to the Vale estate with proper authority, and I bring the man in for questioning, formal and documented, same as any other citizen suspected of fraud and murder. No shortcuts, no favors in either direction. That's all we're asking, Silas said. A fair hearing. Something my brother never got the chance at. Dunmore nodded, slow, something almost gentle in the gesture. I'll do this properly, he said. You have my word on that. But I'll tell you, plain a man like Vale doesn't go quiet usually. Not after building an empire the way he's built his. Best you all stay here safe, while I ride out and see this handled. No, Silas said. Dunmore raised an eyebrow. With respect, Marshal, Silas went on, steady, unmovable. My brother spent his last weeks trying to bring this exact truth into the loan, and it got him killed for the effort. I'm not sitting safe in a rented room while somebody else finishes what he started. I'm riding with you. Adeline stepped forward beside him. So am I. Dunmore studied the two of them a long moment, something that might have been respect moving behind his weathered eyes. All right, he said finally. Against my better judgment, but all right. You stay behind me. You do exactly as I say, the moment I say it. This isn't a rescue mission or a reckoning, whatever it might feel like to either one of you. It's an arrest done proper, and I intend to see it done that way, regardless what Cormac Vale's temper has to say about it. They rode for the Vale estate at first light, 5 of them now, Dunmore, Silas, Adeline, Gus, and Wexford, who had insisted, quiet but immovable, that he intended to see this through to its end, same as the rest of them. The ride took the better part of a day, the mud slowing them nearly as much as it had on the way to Bridger's Crossing, and it was late afternoon by the time they crested the final rise and looked down on the Vale estate, sprawling and grand in the valley below. smoke rising thin and steady from half a dozen chimneys. "Stay close," Dunmore said, checking his own weapon with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who'd done this exact thing many times before. "Whatever happens down there, stay close, and let me handle the talking." They rode down into the yard, and it was clear within moments that Cormac Vale had known they were coming. 8 riders stood arrayed across the front of the house, Ezra Cobb notably absent among them, and Cormac Vale himself stood on the porch. Composed, measured, every inch the picture of a man who had never once in his life believed the consequences of his actions could actually reach him. "Marshal." Vale's voice carried easy across the yard, mild, almost welcoming. "I trust there's some misunderstanding I can help clear up." Cormac Vale. Dunmore's voice carried its own weight, flat and official, cutting clean through whatever performance Vale was attempting. "I have here documented evidence of fraudulent debt manipulation against multiple families in this county, spanning several years, and testimony connecting you directly to the ordered killing of one Micah Rourke, 4 years past. I'm placing you under arrest, pending formal proceedings in Cheyenne." Vale's composed expression didn't crack. Not immediately. But something behind his eyes went very still, very cold, the particular stillness of a man recalculating an entire lifetime's worth of careful assumptions in the space of a single sentence. "That's a serious accusation, Marshal." "Based on what, precisely?" "The word of a runaway girl and a rancher with an old grudge." "Based on this." Dunmore nodded, and Silas stepped forward, produced Micah's letters, held them up where the afternoon light caught the faded ink plain and unmistakable. "Your own scheme, documented in a dead lawyer's hand, 3 weeks before he died on a trail he'd ridden 100 times before without incident." He nodded to Gus. "Based on a witness who saw your riders leaving that same trail the same night, in an unnecessary hurry to be somewhere else." Gus stepped forward, old and steady, meeting Vale's gaze without flinching. "Based on this." Adeline held up the ledger, the careful columns of true rates against reported ones, the pattern spanning multiple families across multiple years. "Your own fraud, laid out plain, in numbers that don't lie even when the man behind them does." And based on this, Oxford's voice, though it shook slightly, carried clear across the yard. "My own signed account. I rode for you, Mr. Vale. Heard Coombs brag more than once about what he did to Micah Rourke, on your direct order. I've put my name to every word of it, and I'll say the same under oath in Cheyenne, whatever it costs me." The yard had gone entirely silent, 8 riders shifting uneasy in their saddles, the weight of the accumulated evidence settling heavy over the whole scene. Vale's composure finally visibly began to crack. "You would take the word of a coward and a traitor," he said, voice sharpening now, the mild welcome gone completely. "Over 4 years of standing in this county as an upstanding citizen, I'd take the word of documented evidence." Dunmore said, unmoved, corroborated 4 separate ways, over the protests of a man whose entire fortune depends on nobody ever looking closely enough to see the shape of what he's built it from. Vale's eyes moved across the yard to his own riders, uncertain now, several already easing their horses back a half step from the center of the confrontation. To Cobb's conspicuous absence, to the marshal's firm, unmovable authority, to Silas Rourke, standing exactly where he'd stood on a different porch, 4 years before Adeline had ever climbed into his wagon, unmoved, unafraid, carrying his dead brother's letters like a shield that had finally, after 4 long years, become a sword instead. Something in Vale's carefully maintained composure finally gave way entirely. "Micah Rourke," he said, voice gone low, almost conversational now, the mask slipping into something considerably uglier underneath, was going to ruin 4 years of careful work over a seamstress's debt he had no legal standing to interfere with in the first place. "I did what any prudent man protects his interests by doing." The yard went dead silent. "You just confessed," Dunmore said quietly, "to ordering a man's death in front of 5 witnesses and a federal marshal." Vale's face went white, the realization of what he'd just said settling in a half-second too late to take back. "That's not, it's exactly what it sounded like," Dunmore said, already moving, already reaching for the restraints at his belt. "Cormac Vale, you're under arrest for the murder of Micah Rourke, and for fraud against the estates of at least 3 families in this county, pending full investigation of every name in that ledger." Vale's hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip, a fast, desperate motion, the last flailing instinct of a man who had never once in his life faced a consequence he couldn't buy or bully his way clear of. Silas moved faster. He was between Vale and the marshal before the older man's hand had fully closed around the grip, close enough now that Vale could see, plain and unmistakable, exactly how little fear remained in Silas Rourke's steady eyes. "Don't," Silas said. "Quiet. Absolute. You've done enough to this family already. Don't give me a reason to make sure you never see the inside of a courtroom at all." Something in Vale's face crumpled at that, not remorse. Silas understood even then, nothing so simple or redemptive as remorse, but something closer to the exact defeat of a man realizing, all at once, that every advantage he'd ever relied on had finally, completely, run out. His hand fell away from the pistol. Dunmore closed the restraints without further incident, firm and businesslike, and Vale said nothing more, offered no further denial, simply stood in his own front yard with his head bowed, the whole architecture of his careful, impatient cruelty finally, irreversibly, collapsed around him. Vale's riders, watching their employer's own words hang irreversible in the cold afternoon air, made their choice one by one, without needing to be told, hands easing away from weapons, horses backing slowly from the center of the yard, 8 men choosing, in the space of a few silent seconds, that whatever loyalty Vale's money had purchased did not extend to standing beside a confessed murderer against a federal marshal. Vale looked at them, looked at the empty space where his authority had stood solid an hour before, looked, finally, at Silas Rourke standing even in the mud of his own front yard, and found Pawnewind, for the first time, in longer than he could remember, absolutely nothing left to say. Dunmore led him away in restraints, and the 8 riders who had once ridden for Cormac Vale watched him go with the particular quiet relief of men who had spent years half suspecting exactly this outcome, and had never quite let themselves hope for it. It was Silas who spoke first, once Vale had been secured, and Dunmore had begun the careful, methodical work of documenting the scene properly. "My brother," he said quiet, to nobody in particular, to the whole cold valley spread out around them, spent his last weeks trying to say exactly what just got said in this yard. It took him 4 years to be heard. Adeline's hand found his. "He's heard now." "He is," Silas agreed, and something in his chest finally, after 4 long years, settled into something that felt a good deal more like peace than grief. Gus stood a little apart, looking at the house, at the whole grand, ill-gotten estate that had cost so many people so much, and shook his head, slow. "4 years," he said. 4 years I carried that silence, telling myself it wouldn't have changed a thing. He looked at Silas, something raw and grateful moving across his weathered face. "Glad to be wrong about that, boy. Gladder than I can rightly say." Wexford, standing a little apart from all of them, looked pale and shaken, the full weight of what he'd just done settling slow over his young face. "I keep waiting to feel something like relief," he admitted quietly. "It comes," Gus told him. "Gentle now, all the gruffness set aside. Takes a while, but it comes." Marshal Dunmore approached the 4 of them once the immediate business of securing Vale's estate had settled into its necessary paperwork, removing his hat, something genuinely respectful in the gesture. "I've made a fair number of arrests in my time," he said, "for a fair number of reasons. Don't often get the satisfaction of watching a case build itself this thorough, or watching the people behind it stand this steady through the whole of it." He looked at each of them in turn. "Silas, Adeline, Gus, Wexford. Your brother would have made a formidable lawyer, Mr. Rourke, if he'd lived to practice the trade proper. Man who builds a case, this careful, 4 years before anybody else thought to look for it, has got real talent for the work." "He never got the chance to prove that talent," Silas said. "Not properly." "No," Dunmore agreed, "but you finished proving it for him today. That's no small inheritance to carry forward." He settled his hat back into place, businesslike once more. "I'll need statements from all of you, formal, before we head for Cheyenne. Won't take long. But I'd be lying if I said the county doesn't owe every one of you a considerable debt for seeing this through." "We didn't do it for gratitude," Adeline said. "No," Dunmore said, something almost gentle in his weathered face. "Best reasons rarely are done for that. Doesn't make the gratitude any less deserved, all the same." News of Vale's arrest reached Larker Hollow before the 5 of them did, riding back through town at dusk, tired and mud-streaked, and still faintly disbelieving of everything the day had held. The street had a different quality to it than the last time Silas had ridden through none of the careful, watchful tension of the previous October. No doorways full of people deliberately not involving themselves. Instead, folks came out onto the boardwalk as they passed. Quiet at first, then not so quiet. Word passing house to house faster than 5 tired riders could travel. Widow Halloran was first to reach them, breathless, parcel forgotten somewhere behind her. "Is it true?" she demanded before Silas had even fully reined in. "Vale? Arrested? For Micah, and for the Marsh girl's mother, and it's true," Silas said. "All of it. Federal marshals got him now, his way to Cheyenne for formal proceedings." Something moved through the gathering crowd at that, a kind of exhale, collective and enormous. 4 years of carefully unspoken fear finally, publicly, permitted to lift. Reverend Hale appeared at the edge of the crowd, quiet, and met Silas's eyes with something like profound relief. "Your brother," he said simply, "would be proud of what you've done here today. He started it," Silas said. "We only finished it." "Finishing it," Reverend Hale said, "was no small thing. Don't diminish it." By the time they reached the edge of town, the whole street had turned out, quiet and watchful, no longer but something closer to celebratory, and Adeline, riding close beside Silas, looked out at the gathered faces with an expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and wonder. "They're not afraid anymore," she said quietly. "No," Silas agreed. "Reckon they haven't been, not really, this whole ride back. Just hadn't had the chance yet to stop pretending otherwise." Cormac Vale's formal hearing was held in Cheyenne 3 weeks later, in a courtroom considerably grander than anything Larkspur Hollow could have offered, and Silas rode down with Adeline, Gus, and Wexford to see it through, same as they'd seen through every other step of that long, hard winter's work. Vale sat at the defense table, diminished in a way that surprised all of them smaller somehow. The peculiar grand authority that had once filled a room simply by his presence, now nowhere in evidence, replaced by the flat, exhausted stillness of a man who had run fully out of angles to work. His lawyers argued what they could, challenged the chain of evidence, questioned Wexford's credibility, suggested Gus's 4-year-old memory of a horse in the dark was hardly the stuff of reliable testimony. None of it held. In the end, he was spurred against the accumulated weight of everything they'd gathered, Micah's own careful, methodical letters chief among it. A dead man's precise legal mind reaching forward 4 years to finally condemn the man who'd silenced him. Wexford testified for the better part of an hour, voice even despite his youth, despite the exposure of standing in a public courtroom, and admitting plainly exactly what he'd once been part of. "Why come forward now?" the prosecutor asked him, after staying silent so long. Wexford was quiet a moment, considering the question with more care than it strictly required. "Because I met a family willing to take in a stranger with nothing but the truth in his hands," he said finally, "and treat that truth like it mattered more than the danger of holding it. Seemed like the least I could do was finally earn the kindness they'd already shown me." Adeline testified after him, steady and unflinching, despite the considerable weight of standing in a public courtroom and recounting, in careful detail, exactly what her mother's final months had actually held. She believed him, Adeline told the court, voice clear, and carrying despite the raw grief still underneath it. "My mother believed Cormac Vale was doing her a kindness. Right up until the day she died still believing it. She never knew the truth of what he'd built around her. I only found out myself 2 weeks before I ran." She looked briefly at Vale, seated flat and silent at the defense table. "I would like it known, for the record, that whatever this court decides today, it comes 4 years too late to save the woman he actually destroyed. But it is not too late for the families still standing." The courtroom had gone very quiet at that, and even Vol's own lawyers seemed to have no ready response prepared for the distinctive unadorned weight of it. The judge, weighing 4 years of documented fraud against 3 separate families and testimony connecting Vale directly to Micah Rourke's murder, handed down a sentence that left little room for appeal or leniency. Cormac Vale would spend the remainder of his considerable fortune and a significant portion of his remaining years answering for exactly what he'd built his empire from. He looked at Silas once as the bailiffs led him from the courtroom, something unreadable moving behind his flat, defeated eyes. "Your brother," Vale said quietly, "was more trouble dead than most men manage alive." He'd have taken that as a compliment, Silas said, and watched Cormac Vale led away. Out of the courtroom, out of Larkspur Hollow's long shadow, out of every life he'd spent years quietly ruining, and felt, at last, the particular clean relief of a debt finally, completely settled. The weeks that followed moved fast, the specific fast of a county, reordering itself once its longest-standing fear had finally been removed from the equation. Vale's estate was seized, pending the full investigation, his fraudulent notes voided one by one as the ledger's evidence bore out family after family's claims. Ezra Cobb, having refused Vale's final order, testified fully and freely in exchange for leniency regarding his own years of complicity, and the county, weighing his cooperation against his conscience finally surfacing, chose mercy over punishment. The Whitmore family, and the Coulter family, and two others besides, found their own fraudulent debts voided in the weeks that followed, the ledger's careful documentation proving, piece by piece, that Constance Marsh had never once been Cormac Vale's only victim, merely the one whose daughter had finally, against every reasonable odd, found the courage and the allies to bring the whole scheme into daylight. The Marsh property, Adeline's mother's land, her grandfather's creek, was returned to her, clear title, free of every debt Vale had ever manufactured against it. Ezra Cobb came to the ranch on a quiet afternoon in early May, alone, hat in his hands, the particular careful posture of a man uncertain of his welcome. Silas found him standing at the gate, not approaching further, waiting to be invited rather than presuming. Cobb. Rourke. The lean rider's eyes were steady, though something uncertain moved behind them. Didn't come to ask for anything. Just came to say what needed saying, and I'll be on my way after. If that suits you better, say it, then. Cobb was quiet a moment, gathering the words with visible effort. I rode past this house 4 years ago, he said finally, the night your brother died. Sat my horse at that same tree line yonder, and watched smoke rise from your chimney, and told myself the whole thing wasn't any of my business to interfere with. His voice had gone rough. I've thought about that night more times than I could count, over the years since, never once found a way to make peace with it, until this past winter finally gave me the chance to choose different. You chose different, Silas said. That's what matters now. Chose it late, Cobb said. Chose it after 4 years of doing nothing at all, while a family grieved a man I might have helped. If I'd had half the courage back then, that boy Wexford found in the end. Silas studied him a long moment, a certain weathered weariness of a man who had spent years compromising small pieces of himself for a steady wage, and had finally, at considerable personal cost, decided the wage wasn't worth what it had been asking of him. My brother, Silas said slowly, used to say a man's measured by what he does once he finally knows better, not by how long it took him to get there. He extended his hand. You knew better. In the end, acted on it when it cost you everything Vale could take from you. That counts for something in my book. Whatever the rest of the county's still deciding. Cobb looked at the offered hand a long moment, something working hard behind his composed face, before he finally took it, firm, grateful. The particular relief of a man finally allowed to set down a weight he'd carried noticeably longer than one winter. Thank you, he said quietly. I don't imagine I deserve it exactly, but I'm grateful for it regardless. Man doesn't always get what he deserves, Silas said. Sometimes he gets what he's willing to earn going forward instead. Seems like you're already working on that part. Cobb nodded. Throat working, and something in the whole shape of that quiet afternoon settled into place. One more thread of the long winter's reckoning finally, gently, resolved. There's a wedding coming, Silas added as Cobb turned to go. 3rd week of May. You'd be welcome to stand at the back of it if you've a mind to. Cobb looked back, surprised, something raw and grateful crossing his weathered face. I'd like that, he said. Reckon I would, very much. She stood at the edge of that creek, the first warm day of real spring, water running high and clear with the last of the mountain snowmelt. And Silas found her there, quiet, watching the current move. You could sell it, he said. Or keep it. Either way, you'd have something solid to build on now. Adeline was quiet a long moment, watching the water. I don't want to sell it, she said finally. I want to keep it in the family. My mother's family, my grandfather's creek. She looked at him, something soft and certain in her expression. But I don't want to live here alone either. Not when there's a house 6 miles west that already feels considerably more like home than this ever did. Silas felt something in his chest go warm, full, entirely unguarded. Is that a proposal? That depends, Adeline said, something teasing creeping back into her voice for the first time in weeks. on whether you're prepared to actually ask me properly, instead of making me do all the difficult work myself, same as usual." He laughed, really laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way 4 years of solitude had once made nearly impossible. "Adeline Marsh," he said, taking both her hands in his, standing at the edge of the creek that had started this whole impossible winter, "will you marry me properly?" No pretending required this time. "There was never any pretending," she said, something uncertain in her voice. "Not from the very first day. You knew that even then." "I did," he admitted. "Took me a while to say so out loud." "You're saying it now." "I am," he said. "Yes. So will you?" "Yes," Adeline said, no hesitation in it at all, the word arriving as easy and certain as the creek running clear beside them. "Yes, Silas Rourke, I will." They were married the 3rd week of May. At the small church in Larkspur Hollow, the whole town turned out in a way that would have seemed impossible 6 months before Widow Holleran in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought for exactly this purpose. Reverend Hale, who had quietly sent more than one of those unmarked baskets over the winter, presiding with visible satisfaction. Ezra Cobb, standing near the back, still finding his footing in a town that hadn't yet decided whether to fully forgive him, but present regardless, because Silas had asked him to be. Gus walked Adeline down the aisle, gruff and visibly emotional in a way he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide behind constant throat-clearing. Wexford stood beside Silas at the altar, the closest thing to family the young man had left in that county, having chosen, over the spring, to stay on at the ranch rather than return to whatever life waited for him elsewhere. Adeline wore cream, simple, practical, a dress she could work a garden in as easily as stand at an altar in, because she'd never wanted something merely to look at. She'd wanted something she could actually live in. She walked down that aisle toward a man who had found her, hiding in the back of his wagon 7 months before, had driven the wrong road through the mountains, rather than hand her over to men who meant her harm, had left notes on a kitchen table, instead of asking questions she wasn't ready to answer, had stood between her and 6 armed riders because she was on his property, and that had made it, simply and completely, his situation to stand in. She thought about the words she'd whispered to him that first afternoon, hiding among his flour sacks and his blankets. "Pretend I'm your wife, until we're out of town." He had never once pretended. Not the driving, not the protecting, not the notes, not the mended curtains, not the hand covering hers across a cluttered desk on 100 quiet winter evenings. None of it had ever been pretending. The vows were simple, the same words spoken in small churches across the whole territory, and yet they landed, for both of them, shoes like something much larger than tradition, the closing of one long winter, the opening of everything that came after it. The reception spilled out onto the churchyard and down toward the small green beside it, tables set with whatever the town had managed to gather on short notice, Widow Halloran's famous preserves, a whole roasted hog somebody's family had apparently been saving for exactly such an occasion, Maddie's own contribution of a cake 3 tiers tall that drew genuine gasps from the assembled crowd. Gus commandeered a fiddle from somewhere, though nobody quite established where, and proved, what, to the considerable surprise of everyone present, to be a genuinely skilled musician. "You never mentioned this particular talent," Silas said, watching the old man draw the bow across the strings with easy, practiced confidence. "Never came up," Gus said, not missing a note. "Man doesn't advertise every skill he's got. Keeps things interesting." The dancing started soon after, the whole green filling, with turning couples in the warm May evening, and Silas found himself, for the first time, in longer than he could remember, wholly comfortable being watched, being seen, being exactly the man he actually was in front of a whole town that had once known him only as the quiet Rourke brother who kept elf. He danced with Adeline first, of course, clumsy, both of them laughing more than actually dancing, neither one having had much occasion for practice, and then, as the evening wore on, with Widow Halloran, who scolded him gently for his thinness the entire dance and seemed, somehow, genuinely delighted to have the excuse. Wexford danced with one of the mercantile clerk's daughters, blushing furiously the entire time, and Gus, between fiddle tunes, made a great show of complaining about his knees, while somehow still managing 3 full dances with 3 different partners before the evening was through. Cobb stood near the edge of the gathering most of the night, quiet, still finding his place in a community, not yet fully certain how to receive him, until Adeline herself crossed the green, unbidden, and held out her hand. "Dance with me, Mr. Cobb." He looked startled. "Ma'am, I'm not asking whether it's proper," Adeline said, something warm and unshakable in her voice. "I'm asking whether you'll dance with me. You stood down from Vale when it mattered most. Seems only right somebody stands up with you now, in return." Cobb, visibly moved, took her offered hand, and the two of them turned slow and careful around the green while half the town watched, and something in that single dance did more to settle Cobb's place back into Larkspur Hollow than any words could have managed. Silas watched it happen, something warm and grateful swelling in his chest, and thought, not for the first time that evening, about how much his brother would have loved every single unlikely piece of this particular gathering. Afterward, in the churchyard, Mattie found her, an old friend of her mother's who'd known Constance Marsh since girlhood, standing close with tears still bright in her eyes. "Your mother," Mattie said softly, "would have found some way to make this happen sooner. She never did have patience for slow romances." Adeline looked over at Silas, laughing at something Gus had said, easy and unguarded in the May sunshine, 4 years of careful solitude worn away entirely by one long winter, and the stranger who'd climbed, uninvited, into every corner of his careful, quiet life. She'd have left him more notes. Adeline said, and Mattie laughed. And Adeline laughed with her, and across the churchyard, Silas looked over at the sound of it, and something in his chest settled, complete and certain, into the exact shape it had been slowly building towards since the moment he'd pulled back a canvas flap and found a stranger hiding among his flour and his blankets. He walked over, took her hand, she held it, and the Wyoming May moved warm and green around them, the mountains that had nearly buried them both in snow, now simply standing quiet and patient at the edge of everything, holding the way mountains do, all the seasons still to come. The first snow of the following winter came early, the second week of October, exactly 1 year to the week, since a young woman in a ruined pink dress had first climbed down from a wagon and looked, wide-eyed, at a ranch house built for more than one person. Adeline stood on the porch watching it fall, one hand resting easy against the small, unmistakable curve of her stomach, and Silas came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her, rested his chin against the top of her head. "Feels different this year," he said quietly, watching it come down. "Good different or hard different?" "Good," he said, certain, no hesitation in it at all. "Considerably good." She turned in his arms to face him, something soft and complete in her expression. "A year ago, she said, I was hiding in the back of a stranger's wagon, praying he wouldn't turn me over to men who meant to force me into a life I never wanted. And now? Now I'm standing on the porch of a home I chose," she said, "with a husband I chose, carrying a child we chose together, watching the same snow that once nearly buried us both fall soft and gentle over everything that came after." She reached up, touched his face, gentle. "I'd say that's a fairly remarkable turn for one single year." "Wasn't luck," Silas said. "Wasn't just luck, anyway. Was you climbing into that wagon in the first place, and trusting a stranger enough to let him drive the wrong road through the mountains. Wasn't just me," Adeline said. "Was you choosing to say yes when saying no would have been so much simpler." "Simpler," he agreed. "Never once better, though." She smiled. What? The same smile that had taken him weeks to work up the courage to look at directly. All those months ago in a cold cabin with the storm howling outside, and he kissed her, shoes soft and slow, on the porch of the house his brother had built with room enough to grow into. Gus found them there. A few minutes later, the fiddle held loose and quiet in one weathered hand, and stood a moment in the doorway, simply watching before he cleared his throat. "You two planning to stand out here catching your death?" he said. "Or is there room enough on that porch for an old man who's earned a rest after 4 dances he had no business attempting at his age?" "Come sit, Gus," Adeline said, laughing, making room between them. He settled in beside them with a groan that was only half exaggeration, and for a long while the three of them simply sat together, watching the snow fall soft over the yard, over the barn, over the whole quiet ranch that had once held nothing but one man's careful solitude, and now held so much more. "Your brother," Gus said eventually, quiet, a thoughtful, Used to sit right here some evenings. Same spot, more or less. Talked about a family filling up this porch someday. Never got the chance to see it happen himself. He's seeing it now, Silas said. However that works, wherever he's watching from. I have to believe he's seeing it now. I believe that too, Gus said, and reached over, patted Silas once on the shoulder, gruff and warm and without need for further words. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, over the whole quiet Wyoming valley, and inside the ranch house the fire burned on, and on the porch 3 people who had built something none of them could have managed alone, sat together in the gathering dark, unhurried and unafraid, exactly where they belonged, a house that had waited 5 long years to be full. Finally, all together, home. Silas Rourke had found a woman hiding in his wagon, and had driven the wrong road through the mountains, and had never once, in 7 months of storms and grief and slowly gathered truth, regretted a single mile of it. He had decided that first cold afternoon not to ask questions on a road before she was ready to answer them, had decided to leave notes instead of demands, had decided that a woman on his property made her safety his situation, plainly and completely, and some things really were that simple, whatever 6 armed riders in his yard might have believed to the contrary, and he had decided, in the end, he was spared to finish what his brother started, to carry a dead man's careful, patient courage the rest of the way down the mountain into the daylight it had always deserved. That was not a grand gesture, in the end. It was a man who had learned, over the course of one long, hard winter, exactly what a house built for more than one person had always been waiting for. She had asked him to pretend. He never pretended a single thing. The lie that got them out of Larkspur Hollow had become, by the time the mountains finally let go of their winter, the truest life either one of them had ever built, proof, if either of them had still needed it, that something start out as nothing more than survival, and grow, slow and patient as a Wyoming spring, into something considerably larger than either person, standing at the beginning of it, could ever have imagined.